So before we start, let's meditate on Lord Shiva. We'll do the dhyana mantra, and then we'll do the opening verse of our text, Paramartha Saram. Om Dhyaya Nityam Mahesham Rajata Girinibham Charu Chandravatamsam Ratna Kalpojvalangam Parashumar Gavara Bheti Hastam Prasannam Padmasinam Samantat Stutam Amaraganairvagakritim Vasanam Vishwadyam Vishwabijam Nikhila Bhayaharam Panchavaktram Trinetram. Oh, I meditate eternally upon that great Lord, Shiva, who shines like a mountain of silver, adorned with the crescent moon, whose limbs flash as if ornamented with many ornaments. He holds in one hand an axe, in the other hand, he holds a deer representing the mind subdued. He offers boons and assures fearlessness with his other two hands. He is seated in samadhi, established in the lotus posture. All about him, sages and other beings are praising him and hymning him. He is the ground upon which the universe rests and the source from which it springs forth. That destroyer of fear, that shining Shiva with 5 faces and 3 eyes, I adore. Om Karpura Gauram Karunavataram Samsara Saram Bhujagendraharam Sadavasantam Hridayaravinде Bhavam Bhavani Sahitam Namami Kailasa Pirtasana Madhya Samstam Bhaktaischa Nandyadhivisevyamanam Bhaktati Davanalama Prameyam Dhyaye Dhumalingita Vishwarupam. Om Namah Shivaya. Now the opening verse of the Paramartha Sara. Om, and I'll put that on the screen actually so you can see it. Sorry. Here it is. So this is the what do you call it? The Mangalacharana. So the invocation of auspiciousness, which contains the entire philosophy of the text in a nutshell, in a bija form. So we'll chant that. Param parastham gahanadanadim ekam nivishtam bahudha guhasu sarvalayam sarvacharacharastham tvameva shambhu sharanam prapadye tvameva shambhu sharanam prapadye. You who are the transcendent goddess Para, you who are established beyond the dense forest of transmigratory existence, you who are prior to all things, and you who are non-dual, you who abide in the heart caves of all beings, manifesting yourself in various ways, and you who are the ground in which all beings rest, wholly immanent in both the moving and unmoving, sentient and insentient, I take refuge in you alone, O Shambhu. Om Tat Purushaya Vidmahe Mahadevaya Dhimahi Tanno Rudra Prachodayat. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Yam. Alright, so as you can see, there's already a really profound point being made in this first Mangalacharana. Before we even get into the philosophical nuance of that verse, immediately what Abhinavagupta has done for us is he's shown the relationship between the Guru, Shiva, and Shakti. Because arguably these are the 3 primordial principles of the tradition. You could even argue that in spiritual life you have 3 things that you have to come to terms with, 3 things to understand. The first is this individual, so we can call this Nara, or the self. And interestingly, this individual is a sort of sentience. I feel myself to be a self because I'm self-reflexively available to myself. That is to say, when I smell, I know that I'm smelling. Or when I'm hearing something, I know that I'm hearing it. Or even when I don't know something, like if I don't know what's going on in the room next door, I know that I don't know it. So there's a sort of metacognition, as we were saying last night, that attends to every single cognition. So every sensual event, whether it's smelling or tasting, seeing, touching, hearing, or any cognitive psychological event, like when I'm thinking or dreaming, or even when I'm in deep sleep and I wake up and I remember that I slept without any dreams, I slept deeply. At every point, whether or not there is a psychological or physical sensation, there will always be the sense of self-reflexivity. Like, I know that I am. So this we call, I guess you could say, sentience. That might be a nice word for it. Just, I'm sentient. And sentience, by the way, I'm sorry, I'm just going to clean this off. Sentience, by the way, is intuited in other beings also. So this is actually a big problem in philosophy. It's called the problem of other people. And that doesn't just mean all the people in your DMs giving you a hard time. It means, do people really exist? Are there actually other sentient beings? A really difficult philosophical problem, actually. And you can see why. I don't at any point have access to another person's sentience. You know, so the question here is, how do I know, it's an epistemological problem, how do I know that the other people around me who behave like me, who present themselves as sentient beings, how do I know they're actually sentient? Isn't it possible that like you could design a being that is perfectly behaviorally like a human, like a sentient being, but itself not have any sentience? How would you verify another being's sentience? Because look, even if you were telepathic, or clairvoyant or something, if you could like, what do you call it, like when you can read minds or something, even if you had access to a person's subjective being, like, sorry, I shouldn't say that word, even if you have access to a person's thoughts and emotions, you don't necessarily have access to their subjectivity. You see, because you can't know that they're conscious. You might even know their thoughts, yeah, maybe clairsentient, some kind of sense of knowing what's going on in a person's mind, you know. So many of us don't have that. So when we look at someone, there's the body presenting itself to us, and we assume that beyond the body there is a mind endowed with willing, with knowing, and with doing that powers the body. And then therefore we assume that that too is a sentient being like me. And there are animals, and then there are maybe plants, and for a long time maybe plants weren't even considered sentient. But then now we see animals, we see plants, we see other beings, and we assume there's some kind of mind there, but we don't really have access to it, except in the terms that it manifests, in the sense that it manifests in behavior. So isn't it possible that you could design like a self-driving car or something that behaves as if it has will, as if it has knowledge, as if it has a sort of desire even? Like it chooses to go left as opposed to go right, or it makes decisions as if it's doing some kind of intellectual process. But it's possible that it's not really thinking. It's just mechanically executing its programming on the behavioral level. But even if you were whatever, if you had some telepathic ability, even if you were able to access people's thoughts, that doesn't actually mean that you verified their sentience. Because it's possible for thoughts to appear and there be no one there to like receive them or to think them. You know, so it's not a given that just because you have access to a body, just because even if you have access to a person's mind, it's not a given that you have access to their sentience, their consciousness. So this is called the problem of other people. We don't actually know whether other people are conscious or not, but we intuit that they are. There's a deep felt sense that I am not the only sentient conscious being in this world. When we look at another, although we can't intellectually understand why we think they're sentient, we just know that they are. We intuit that they are. So it's intuitive to say that I am not the only sentient being, that every other being that is like me is also sentient, and even beings that aren't like me. For instance, animals, like a squid or something. Very little resemblance between me and the squid. So even like outside of the mammalian sense, like there are all these beings in the world that don't at all look like me, like say a spider or something like that. A spider's thoughts must be so different from my thoughts. Like, how different would our inner worlds be? Do we even have inner worlds? Like, I have one, but does the spider have one? And recently, I think there are some academic studies on whether or not animals dream. And it's clear that mammals dream. Of course, you can see your dog kind of wagging its tail or running in the middle of its nap. So obviously, it's like enacting something in its mind. But they've discovered that even ants dream. I mean, you know, the rapid eye movement, they call it, REM sleep. It's like when you're dreaming. The ant also has that, but it's for the antenna. So I think it's RAM or something, rapid antenna movement. So the ant's antenna twitches when it's sleeping. And so you might ask, what's an ant's dream like? Isn't that a beautiful question? So what's an ant's subjective experience? And based on that experience throughout its day, it might be having some kind of dream. Some impressions from the ant's day-to-day life might be left over, such that when the ant goes to bed, interestingly, in its subjective experience arises some dream, maybe based on what happened that day. Something like maybe a worker ant's dream is different from a soldier ant's dream or something. They're probably all just dreaming about the queen, right? But whatever the ant dreams, it's significant that the ant is dreaming. So even an ant, you know, a spider, like maybe a single-celled organism, maybe dream is common to all sentient beings, not just to mammals or just to humans. So when we look at a spider, we say, I don't think the spider's thoughts are like my thoughts. And we probably think in a very different way. I don't think that we have the same desires or the same motivations. Maybe on a base level, yes, to survive and reproduce, that might be common to all living things. But how that desire to survive and reproduce is enacted or felt even, that's going to be so different between me and the spider. And yet, when we see a spider, before we smash it, we think, oh my God, that's a being just like me. Let me catch it and take it outside. Because I don't want to kill that being, because I too would not want to be killed. So the sense that if I were to smash the spider, I would be killing another sentient being, that sense arises. It's different from, say, like crumpling up a piece of paper and maybe throwing it into the trash can. I don't get this sense of, I am ending the life of this piece of paper or something. When I look at the spider, I recognize that to be a being with will, with knowledge, with action. And therefore, even if I am to kill it, there's a recognition that I'm killing another being or something. The sense that there is sentiency in the spider, just like there is sentiency in me. Although maybe the sentiency, the way it's felt in both of us is very different. So therefore, we might not know for a fact whether or not other beings exist, whether or not spiders are sentient, or whether Dalit Ma or Deepa Leela Devi or anyone is really sentient, but we sense that. And that's enough for us to at least say that in this world, there is such a thing as sentient beings. Now, one word for this is nara. Nara means man or person, man in like the human sense. But that word is actually not inclusive enough. The word nara just includes human mammals. But like we just pointed out, human mammals are not the only ones that have sentience in the sense that they're willing, knowing, doing things. We can extend that to a spider or to a reptile or to a squid or something. So the word of choice actually in the Shaiva tradition, although you will see the word nara from time to time, is paśu. And this to me already is so profound because paśu means beast or it means animal. And now humans are paśus. Humans are human animals, just like a cow is a paśu, just like a spider is a paśu. All sentient beings in this world can be called paśus. In this sense, the Shaiva tradition refuses to distinguish human animals from all the other animals. There's just like a spectrum of individuals. Some are animals, some are humans. It's just about sentience. And so the spider is sentient, the human is sentient, and that's that. So sentient being is what we mean by paśu. But notice this, a paśu as a sentient being naturally also feels some kind of limitation. So the word paśu means beast, but in a technical philosophical sense, in this tradition, the word paśu, implies a sort of limitation also. Carlos G, I think so. Why, is something wrong? Carlos G's like, are you all right? Do I sound mad? Sometimes I'm checking in with you guys, like, am I off the rails? Like, I think this is coherent. Maybe it's not. We've been doing a lot of all-night sadhana recently, so we're a bit sleep-addled. You know, the sun has become very offensive these days. So after all night in Smashan, the sun comes up, you're like, ugh. So this is a little early for us, given our Kali Puja schedule. So yeah, maybe it's that. Maybe we're a bit addled. Anyway, coming back to the paśu problem. The paśu is a bound soul in that it is a sentient being, but as part of its sentience, it feels a will, but it also feels that will get impeded from time to time. So it might want something, but there might be something about reality, quote unquote, time and space, that prevents it from getting that will, fulfilled. So let's say a spider might want to live. It has a will to live. And then somebody comes along and kills it. So its will to live has been impeded, obstructed. So therefore its will to live is not an unimpeded free flow of spontaneous desire. There are checks and balances to it, which are inherent in the time and space in which that paśu finds itself, in which it has its being. Then its knowledge is also limited. So its will is limited, its desire is of course limited, its knowledge, its understanding of the world is limited. There are things that we know, and there are lots of things that we don't know. There's a limitation in terms of knowledge. And more importantly, there's a limitation, we would argue, above all, in terms of action. There's only so much potency a paśu has. And yes, we can increase that potency maybe. Throughout our life, we can maybe make more money, and with more money, there might be more options for an individual, or we might exercise and bring more energy into our system, or learn how to conserve our energy better, and then we might be able to do more. Maybe we can deepen our willpower and our motivation, or something like that. So it's possible to increase our potency, but it seems like only up to a point. Most of us are limited in terms of action, again, by time and space. So if I wanted to do like 10 things, the amount of time I have in the day might limit whether or not I can do all 10 of those things. I might only be able to do 5 or 6 of those things at best. Given I have the energy, I would be able to do maybe 5 or 6 at best because I'm limited by time. But if I was not limited by time, I might instead be limited by energy. You know, I might find, oh yes, thank you, you're right. I am wheezing a little bit, I think. Thank you for pointing that out. I think last night's lectures, because I gave the middle school class and then we were lecturing throughout the night, I think I'm starting to feel a little breathless from all this lecturing. That's okay. That's her problem. But now the next thing is, you have to take care of your instruments, ma. Otherwise, how are they going to... Now, next thing is this pashutva is a limitation in terms of, also a lot of... Yeah, you're right. Leela ma, it's Nitya Leela saying is homa and... Yeah, what to do. So, homa and cigarettes. That's not a good combination, actually. The smoke from the homa. But now, next thing is, there's a sense of knowledge, but also that knowledge is super limited. So even if I have infinite time and infinite energy, which we don't, there's also a limited knowledge. And so when I'm doing something, I might not know how to do it, actually. So if I want to do 10 things, I might only have enough knowledge or understanding to do 5 or 6 of those things. But finally, because there's all of this limitation to knowledge and limitation to time and space, there's a limitation in action. If I don't actually finish those 10 things, even if I will to do those 10 things, my will is impeded. I might only be able to do 5 or 6. So a pashu has will, has knowledge, and has action, but those are all limited. So pashu is the technical term for any sentient being in this universe. And every sentient being is distinctly aware of its own limitation. And we would argue actually that you can make a further distinction here between mrigas and pashus. Although this distinction doesn't need to be made, a mriga is any sentient being that does not yet keenly feel its own limitation. And that's very rare. Like, what being exists that doesn't feel its own limitation and struggle to overcome it? Think of the plant. The reason why we can include plants as a pashu, beyond just all of J.C. Chandra Bose's experiments, like kind of showing plant sentiency, and besides that wonderful book that came out and has thus been much criticized, actually, The Secret Life of Plants or something like that. Put those aside for a moment. At the very least, you can see how a plant responds to limitation. It grows, and then if there's some obstruction, it grows around that obstruction. It desires sunlight, and so if the sunlight is in some other place, it angles itself to go and get that sunlight, or creeps around some other plant or something like that. It responds to its needs and moves towards that which it wants, and it moves away from that which it doesn't want. So you can recognize some kind of will here, and that might point to its sentiency. There are things the plants arguably know how to do. Like, they know how to, if you want to use the word know, they know how to convert sunlight into oxygen like that, or into food or something. So that kind of process is occurring, and that action is given to the plant. But notice, the way that it responds to limitation, that itself is enough to identify its pashutva. The rock might not respond to limitation in the same way. The rock doesn't struggle to overcome a limitation imposed upon it. Isn't that an interesting thought? What makes a pashu is not necessarily willing or knowing or doing. It's responding to limitation in a way that struggles to overcome it. Isn't that wonderful? So the plant does that. The animals do that. All animals are working so hard to overcome limitation. It's wonderful to see. And one of the most inspiring things you can encounter in a city is that little plant that pokes its head up between the cracks in the concrete. How beautiful. You see, like, nature asserting itself. Even when suppressed by all this concrete, the plant still manages somehow to eke out an existence there in the crack. So that's always very thrilling as human beings to see. We're inspired by the struggle and those who have worked hard to overcome it, even those who have failed to overcome it. The very attempt to struggle against limitations, obstacles, that itself is innate to the pashu. So I would argue the pashu, by definition, the sentient individual soul, is 3 things. It's a willing being, it's a knowing being, and it's a doing being. So anything that wills, knows, and does is by definition a pashu. But let's deepen that. A pashu, the next definition of a pashu, is any being that senses its own limitation. And that's when life begins, arguably. You use your willing, your knowing, and your doing to actually overcome any limitation that you might encounter within this experience that you're having. So therefore, I would define, or the tradition defines a pashu as that being which is aware of its own limitation, which I would argue is innate to all pashus. But here we can make a further point, a kind of beautiful point actually. The ultimate limitation is pashutva itself, the sense of being an individual embodied soul. That itself is the ultimate limitation. So there are some people who are content with that actually. They're content with just making a bit of money, or with having a bit of pleasure, or with maybe becoming a little renowned or a little recognized in their community or friend group. They're very content with little things. And pejoratively, sometimes we use the word worldly. And of course, the Tāntrik tradition is not likely to use that word in a pejorative sense, but they will argue that many people in this world are not yet interested in spiritual life. What exactly is spiritual life? We would argue that it's the quest to go from a limited sense of who you are to an all-encompassing sense of I am. So when you are able to say I am, and with that statement mean everything and everyone all together at once, then you have attained what is called Purna Hamta. Technically speaking, you become Shiva. Shiva is that being, that I am, who recognizes itself, I would say, in all things, as all things maximally, and is also that which is beyond all things. So it's the transcendent, immanent absolute, and you are that actually. The desire to recognize yourself as that, to feel yourself as that, is what we call spiritual life. It's the quest. So we're all here, arguably, on this Zoom call, the 40 or so of us who are here listening to this talk. We're here because we sense that the things that life has to offer us are great, but we want more. We're not satisfied with however much money life can give us. We know that the things that money can buy can only bring us finite joy. We're satisfied with all the pleasures in the world. It's wonderful to drink good tea. And we actually, so much milk has been offered that we've run out of milk in the house. So good tea to me requires milk and sugar, but I will settle for this black. That's why I'm wheezing and dying, Ma, because I have no milk. What am I going to do? There's no nourishment in this tea. But this claim that the things of this world, however pleasant, like the best chocolate cake, or like the best orgasm, or like the best sunset, all of these are all so beautiful. But interestingly, they don't bring lasting fulfillment. Or even if they're able to fulfill us, we sense that there's a deeper way in which we can be fulfilled. And that's a really beautiful question, Virupakshima. I'll come to that in a bit. So there's this sense in which a person might be content with what the world has to offer. Because what the world has to offer is very limited. If a person is content with limited things, that's only because they haven't recognized the limitation in them. You see? So it's possible actually to be a sentient being, but not really be cognizant in the deepest sense of those things that are limiting you. Isn't that a thrilling thought? That a person can go through this life, but not actually sense the ways in which they are limited. So they might think, I'm limited because I don't have enough money. Be careful. That's not a very reflective conclusion. It's true, maybe if you had more money, then maybe your agency in the world might increase. So we think. But then we discover, often very quickly, that to make more money, I often have to do things that take away time and energy. And so even though I might have more money, I don't have time and energy to actually spend that money in the way that the money promised. Or I have time and energy, but then there's no money with which to do or carry out my will. Or I just don't have any other way of thinking resourcefully, because money, as we argued in the Lakshmi Puja lecture, is not at all the only way to understand abundance, and it's not the only resource available to us. But that being said, time-space itself is the limitation. So as long as I'm experiencing temporality, as long as I'm experiencing a sense of space, a sense that I'm here and you're there, as long as that experience persists, in other words, as long as there's a sense of separation, no amount of money will ever overcome my limitation. So having reasoned thus, a person's quest to make a lot of money, that is attenuated, as it were, because they no longer are convinced that that's going to give them what they want. Say fame or something. A person wants to connect with others, so they want to be famous, because they feel like if they were famous, then everybody would love them. So then they could maybe walk down the street or something, and they would be recognized, and that attention maybe might be important to give them a sense of value in this world, you know. So therefore, they work really hard to become famous. And all of these things are wonderful. The struggle to make a lot of money, the struggle to become famous, the struggle to like gain anything you want in this world, that's valuable actually. It's beautiful to watch and it's beautiful to like witness. But even having acquired all that fame, a person might realize that they still don't have the connection that they're craving. Everybody might love them, but also now there are a lot of people who are like, maybe, I don't know, stalking them, or like threatening them, or like only friends with them because they want to be part of like that inner circle of fame. Or if you're really rich, people only want to be your friends because they want to get some of that money or something. You get the sense of like, there are more people in my life, but quantity doesn't necessarily mean quality. Like I'm struggling to connect because even if someone loves me, I can't trust that their love is for me and not for my money and not for my fame. Because in one sense, we feel like the fame and the money don't really define us. So if we are famous and if we are wealthy and if people love us, there's always going to be the sense of, well, maybe they just love the fame, maybe they just love the money. And of course, they didn't love me before. You know, like now they're all here, but where were you all before I had all of this stuff? And it's not their fault. They're only right to love the money and the fame because they too sense that if they had a piece of that pie, they would be happy. Like, quote unquote, you're supposed to be happy. And then we all realize the predicament that we're in. No matter how much fame, how much money, how much power, how much pleasure we acquire in this life, there's always going to be this primordial sense of separation. The kind of connection we want with another being is just not possible no matter how close we bring our bodies. So no amount of physical intimacy can actually create that connection that we're seeking. So we seek it in emotional intimacy. But again, we can talk all night, all the rest of our lives, and still that emotional intimacy, that intellectual intimacy, which is wonderful, make no mistake, is still not quite that connection that we crave. There's something still missing. And if you sense that, then spiritual life has started. So therefore, when Buddha defines dukkha in the philosophies after the Buddha's life and teaching, we find that there's a lot of nuance to that word actually. Dukkha can be understood on so many different levels. Dukkha, which means suffering in one sense, but it also means bad space, literally. Dukkha. Ka means space, du means unpleasant or bad. So to contrast it to sukha, sukha would be good space, dukkha would be bad space. And it might even refer to the way a chariot wheel is fitted into the axis. So a dukkha, in one sense, is a bad fit. The wheel doesn't go well into the axis, and if that doesn't happen, if the fit doesn't happen, you're in for a very bumpy ride. Right? It won't be a smooth chariot ride. So to use that metaphor from the Katha Upanishad of the body and mind and intellect as like the chariot with the horses and the charioteer, like dukkha is when the experience of your body, mind, and intellect is unpleasant, is bumpy and problematic. That's called dukkha. But you can understand that in so many different ways. In one sense, it's any physical pain that you're having. If you're ill, if you're being tortured by an oppressive government, like all of that would be dukkha in a very physical and tangible sense. So we work really hard to overcome that. And we should work hard to overcome that. We should improve our systems of hygiene. We should clean up our systems of politics, our systems of redistribution. Like that's an effort to solve for dukkha on the level of the body. So making sure that everyone has enough to eat is very important. Making sure that they have education and ways to like make an income so they can support their families and communities. All of that's really important. But it only removes dukkha on the physical level. So even if you are able to guarantee everyone in the world food and shelter and like a sustainable and comfortable life, physically speaking, that still won't be enough. It won't make them happy. It's a start, and you need to start here, of course, taking Maslow's hierarchy quite seriously. You need to have these things. You cannot preach religion to an empty stomach, as we would argue. So making sure that everyone has food is important, but it doesn't stop there. Because the next thing, arguably, is to give meaning to that life that you've guaranteed for everyone. So the meaning from life comes from, arguably, education, art, entertainment. So then culture, the developing of culture comes next. Often that goes hand in hand with the first thing. So the need to survive on the level of the body can also influence culture. You know, that the two things come together because what it means to be human is not just to pursue survival for its own sake, but to pursue a life that matters. So that's an interesting idea that like it's not just about physical survival, it's about psychological meaning. So we make art. It's usually in times of war that some of the best art is made. Is when your life is at risk, that's when we become truly creative. That's when we start to think about what life really means and we paint and we write poems and we do theater, etc. So that's also part of life. But look, even if you had the best case scenario in which infant mortality rate is at an all-time low, bodies more or less were cared for, there's more or less enough food, more or less enough opportunities for education or for work. Even without education, some vocational training is possible, some work is possible. Even if you had all of this, even then you might not actually solve for suffering. Because even if you solve for psychological suffering, you find there's still some deep sense in which something is missing. This is the dukkha, arguably, that the Buddha is speaking to primarily. So the dukkha of the body and the dukkha of the mind, those should be overcome. But the dukkha of the spirit, the dukkha of the soul, yeah, Virupakshi, there you go. The dukkha. So part of this is to your question that you texted me some time ago. The dukkha of the soul is a felt sense of separation between me and you, between me and other beings, actually between me and all things. That sense of separation will never be removed, no matter how pampered the body is and how cared for the mind is. So we would argue then that a very mature person takes up spirituality, because by mature we mean that person has at some point already secured all the sukha of the body and already secured all the sukha of the mind. Therefore, we would argue, in the Vedic period, this is argued, that you should pursue these things first. it's very hard to have a sense of what spiritual life is and what it can do for you until you have all of these things. And until you have all of these things, there's always the risk that you will use spirituality to get those things and thereby miss out on what spirituality really has to offer. So, for example, someone comes to spiritual life and they start teaching spiritual life, but then very soon they are more interested in the money that their spirituality can generate. So it becomes about money. So then you'll find, right, like it's always about donations. That's the thing about spiritual spaces. They're always handing out the tithes because very quickly, and of course, yeah, you need donations maybe for, but very rarely are we getting donations because we need them. Often we're getting donations because we want money, but that's only because maybe we haven't had it before, and maybe we have real needs. We have to sustain the community and ourselves and things like that. But that's not spirituality. Spirituality, I'm going to define as that attempt to overcome the primordial dukkha that exists, that you can feel even when the body is perfectly healthy. Not even healthy, but I would even argue perfectly pampered. Like you're just having all the sorts of comforts the body could desire, you know? Isn't it possible to be having a really nice smoke in a beautiful air-conditioned room after a wonderful meal and the best sex of your life, and you're just there in post-coital bliss? Isn't it possible even then to feel dissatisfied? And some people do feel that. They get everything they want, the best drugs, everything. But then after a while, everything just feels so sugarless. It just feels so meaningless. Even though on the physical level, they have every sort of thing. That's why sometimes the wealthy are even more depressed than those who don't yet have that sort of lifestyle. Because at least if you don't have wealth, you're preoccupied by the struggle to get wealth. But once you get wealth and once you buy all the things that money supposedly can buy, it's really depressing to realize that that's not actually doing it for you. It might for a year or two, right? But then after a while, you get this sense of ennui or divine discontent. Then you might get in this project of culture or like refining your mind, of learning. And no matter how far you go with that, you can become the greatest artist or the greatest appreciator of art, visual art, music, whatever. You can be such a connoisseur and you can be so intelligent, but even then you might still sense that you're not satisfied. So in the best case scenario, there in here still in your experience some dukkha. That dukkha is what spirituality is about, the attempt to overcome dukkha. But notice, to recognize that dukkha, you know, the Buddha said the root of suffering is this thirst. But what exactly I would argue is this thirst for? Is this thirst for, I'm going to put the Buddhist idea aside. I'm going to say it's this sense that I am limited and I thirst to be fulfilled. So it's a wonderful thing actually to recognize this limitation. That defines the paśu. So if a paśu senses its physical limitation, good. If it senses its intellectual limitation, good. It's still a paśu. But it's arguably only, we could say, only really a paśu when it recognizes its spiritual limitation, its sense of separation. And so therefore the tradition might even offer another phrase, vrigaha, to distinguish the spiritually seeking from the non-spiritually seeking. Those who are content with the limited pleasures of the world, which again are not bad in and of themselves, just limited. They would be called mrigas, wild. Wild in the sense that they are not interested in spiritual discipline, in some system of practice that will lead them from the finite to the infinite. So mriga means wild. Paśu means bound, but here bound in the sense that they are binding themselves to a tradition, to a teacher, to a discipline, to some practice. So the word has a positive connotation of one who is working to restrain the mind, or rather, one who realizes their true state as being limited by time, space, and separation. So therefore, a paśu, we could say, is any sentient being, but if you want to define that further, you could say it's ideally a sentient being that recognizes its limitations on every level, primarily a spiritual one. And we would argue there is no person in this world that does not intuitively sense their spiritual limitation, their sense of separation. In fact, every human project, whether it's starting an NGO or like, I don't know, making a social media account or calling up a friend that you haven't seen in a while, every endeavor that we do as human beings, I would argue has this desire at its core, to overcome that limitation that we feel at a very intuitive primordial level. The desire to connect, the desire to overcome our own finitude. So a paśu then can be defined as a person who is spiritually awakened to their limitation. So therefore we can introduce the word now, shaktipat. Shaktipat is that moment where a person senses this limitation. And that's when usually they start seeking a guru or they start becoming interested in spiritual life. Actually, they might not immediately look for a guru. They might in the beginning just start to like dip their toes into the water a bit. So they might purchase some books, read a whole bunch of books. They might listen to a lot of lectures. They might visit the various spiritual communities that are close to them. So they might go to the ISKCON temple or the Zen Buddhist center. They might visit the Vedanta centers that are in most of the cities around the world. Like they just start exploring and they start interacting with others and talking to them about this stuff. So they look for communities that share their interest in spirituality. And they might dabble with a few different things, a few different traditions. But then after a while of doing this, maybe they become very, very serious about like actually doing the project. So then maybe they will look for a lineage to belong to. They'll look for a guru, and from that guru, they'll receive a practice and they will bind themselves to that practice. They become a paśu in the sense that they're a disciplined spiritual practitioner working really hard to overcome their sense of separate self, their sense of individual embodied existence. So that's what we would define as a paśu. Now notice Shaktipat again can be nuanced. And so to your question, Virupakshi is asking, is there a state in between? Again, this is so beautiful. Our tradition will always say yes and no. I think the series of questions you sent me, Virupakshi, I was like, oh no, we have to discuss them in person because they're nuanced. Very nuanced questions require very nuanced answers. So here, if you ask, is there a state in between being worldly and being content with the limited things of the world and the state of being quote unquote spiritual and pursuing the unlimited bliss of Purnahanta, complete I amness? Is there an in between? In one sense, no. Shaktipata is a kind of all or nothing sort of thing in the sense that prior to Shaktipata, you're not at all interested in spiritual life. Like at all. And that's very true for some people. They just do not want to hear about it. They're not interested in it. And many of these people might actually go to church. They might profess a religion actually. So don't conflate spirituality with religion. Here we're saying spirituality is the earnest and sincere quest to realize some kind of wholeness. Usually when people become spiritual, they also become quite liberal as to what traditions they're going to study. It's very rare that you find a spiritual person who is also dogmatic about their tradition, because they're willing to take anything that will help them. And their interest itself will push them out of the dogmatic view of whatever tradition they find themselves in. So if you become genuinely spiritual, you'll also become kind of open, I think, to what do you say? Like you'll become, I would argue, you become kind of open to uh other traditions because you want to learn. You're like actually interested in learning. I would argue many people who profess a faith don't actually have an interest in even learning that faith. So it's not like they're on their own studying the Bible. They're like going to church as part of their social cultural responsibility because maybe arguably they're like afraid to be judged for not going to church. Then they end up at church and they're like looking at their pastor and listening to their pastor, but they might not actually be reflectively contemplating what the pastor is saying. They're like, okay, hate the gays. Yes, don't vote for this political party. Okay, yeah, this is all in the Bible, duh. Like this is and they're just like they're listening. But then the pastor might even give a really great sermon like about the beautiful depth of Christianity, but you might just be sitting there and like just goes over your head. And then notice that must be the case because then when you step out, what do you talk about? Oh, my son is struggling in school now. He's getting a B minus. He used to get an A, but now he's like, I don't know, maybe he's doing drugs. Probably because he's hanging out with your son, like that. They start getting into all this like gossip, and they talk about everything under the sun except whatever was spoken about in the sermon. So it's quite clear that the sermon maybe didn't have that much of an impression on many of us. So when we're going to church or going to the temple, when we're listening to our pundits speak about our religions, even when we read the books that we're supposed to read as members of a quote unquote religion, we might not actually care. It might just be something we do as part of a cultural responsibility. That's why, you guys, Hinduism can be so frustrating for you because you all have conflated Hinduism probably with spirituality because most of you have come to Hinduism as a result of your spiritual quest. So then you go to this quote unquote Hindu temple nearby where you live, and then you're thoroughly disappointed because when you get there, you find that everyone there is like at your churches, just talking about food and about, community and whatnot. Just because the temple doesn't mean it's a spiritual space. It's usually just a cultural center, and that's wonderful too. That has its role, especially when Indians come to this country, when they come to the UK, or when they come to America, or they move to Europe, or wherever they come to Canada. It's a scary thing to be in someone else's country. You don't speak the language, and you're trying to make the money to send back to your family. You need your community, and the temple is a community center where you and some other Bengalis might get together and speak in your own language and feel safe, in this foreign country. But that doesn't necessarily imply that you're all there to realize God. So I think the idea that a temple is automatically spiritual, the idea that a church is automatically spiritual, the idea that a religion is automatically spiritual, any religion, whether that's Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity or Judaism or anything, that we should push back against. Religion or spirituality is truly the attempt to overcome one's felt sense of limitation, and that's rare. To feel that limitation itself is quite rare. So then, this question. Is Shaktipata all or nothing? Are you worldly or spiritual? Is that it's like a dichotomy? Isn't that a false dichotomy? Look how nuanced this answer is from the tradition, the Tantric non-dual tradition. The answer would be, yeah, no, in this sense, because if you really, really felt this limitation, that can only be because of Shaktipata. There must be some awakening within you. Something must have changed, and Shaktipata, therefore, operationally is grace. It's God's grace that you recognize your limitation. So once you recognize that, that alone will maybe make you look more closely at your religion. So if you belong to a religion, you don't need to leave it. You can just be like, I wonder if there's something to this. And there is. Every religion in the world has something to offer. We're just not really looking for it. But then once Shaktipata occurs, then we finally become interested in what the Bible actually is saying. And that's why it can be frustrating sometimes because you're looking for answers and you're asking questions, but the people around you that are representing your faith might not actually have the answers to the questions that you're asking because they don't have the same questions. They don't ask the same questions, they therefore have not gone on the quest that would allow them to have the answers that they could then supply you. Although they're ministers, although they're priests, although they're pastors, they might not be gurus. In other words, they might not be genuine spiritual teachers because there isn't yet genuine spirituality in them. You might ask your congregation, you might ask your pastor, you might ask your priest, you might ask your family, and you'll be stunned. Most of the questions that you have are not questions that are shared. And you can't imagine why. You feel like these are the most important questions possibly, but no one else seems to be asking them. So that would be a sense in which you're awakening to spirituality, awakening to the quest, and then the disillusionment that comes when you realize that this is actually kind of rare in this world. So therefore, people tend to look outside of their faith, outside of their community, outside of their understanding of religion, because they're genuinely curious. So they start reading other traditions, and they realize like, oh my God, there's so much to everything. I grew up within the context of Sanatana Dharma, of course. I had everything growing up. But then I was seized with this desire to go down to the local church where I stayed just to acquire a Bible to see what that was all about. And I like devoured it in like a weekend. And I was like, this is awesome. It's such a like so beautiful. There's so much in it, especially I was so inspired by the New Testament, all the things that the Christ said, because I don't have any of the baggage of people in the West having been raised in a church. So that desire to go and acquire a Bible for somebody who grew up in a Tāntrik Shaiva household, that desire could only have arisen, I would argue, if I was genuinely interested in religion, not just in my religion. And that's why the avatarhood of Sri Ramakrishna is very important, because we don't define religion as the plurality of cultural responses to truth. We define religion as that sincere quest for the absolute that can take any form and often does take different forms in different people, owing to the fact that we're all so different and we respond to reality differently. So with that said, a paśu, as a result of Shaktipata, only realizes their paśutva. Without Shaktipata, the paśutva, the sense of paśutva would not occur. Like you won't feel limitation. You won't, arguably, you're not even yet a paśu in a sense, because you haven't awakened to your limitation. And so Shaktipata is how you awaken to it. And now to bring some more nuance to the answer, yes, there are those who don't feel their limitation, even those who profess a religion that cannot be called spiritual. And there are those who are spiritually interested, who might not even belong to religion, but that Shaktipata is the difference. So in this sense, it's a yes or no kind of thing. It's an all or nothing kind of thing. Either you sense a limitation or you don't. And that will fundamentally change the way you interact with your religion and with the other religions of the world. But wait, according to Abhinavagupta, in his discussion on Shaktipata, chapter 9, I believe, in the Tantra Loka, he gives, interestingly, 9 different kinds of Shaktipata, 9 different degrees of Shaktipata. So although Shaktipata is all or nothing, there are 9 different degrees. So if you get a really high degree of Shaktipata, you immediately recognize your limitation, and then you immediately recognize that it's not true. In other words, sensing your limitation, you immediately overcome it. You realize, oh my God, I'm bound, so you jump out. Isn't that interesting? The moment you realize it, you're already free of it, and you instantly become one with everything. That's like the highest degree of Shaktipata, and often it's a total KO. The body and mind just fall away, and you become one with everything. It obliterates you. So, I don't know, we should hand out liability waivers or something, because if somebody were to get this degree of Shaktipata, they would be annihilated. Then and there, they would be burnt up to a crisp by the power of this descent of grace. That's the highest degree of Shaktipata. Some other people, like let's say Ramana Maharshi or some very rare individuals in this world, they get the second degree Shaktipata, where it's so strong that they're fully awakened, but they're still able to keep their body and like continue for some time. But they're fully awakened. From that point on, they become like world teachers. They know exactly what they are, and that's clear and obvious, and it's a vibrational thing. You can't just say it, by the way. If you just say, oh yeah, I'm fully awakened, that's a delusion, because in most cases, no one will agree. Whereas in the case of Sharamana Maharshi or people like that, they don't even say it. They don't say I'm awakened, but everybody knows. And they, like bees to a flower, flock around such a being. So if a being receives a very strong Shaktipata, they awaken to their true nature as the all-encompassing self, and maybe they can keep their body. Often a person like this might not need any teachings, but might get them anyway for the sake of grounding and stabilizing their realization. So Ramana Maharshi, it's true, didn't need a teacher. He just at age 16, like lay down on the floor after his father died and suddenly dramatically realized that he was Brahman. And notice, in the days that followed, he became increasingly disinterested in school, in the things of the world. And then he just left. One day he just walked out of his house. He didn't even feel himself to belong to his family, which was really tragic and difficult for his family, no doubt. They just walked out of the home, but what did he do? He went to Arunachala, to a mountain which is considered to be an embodiment of Lord Shiva. So maybe he was seeking his guru there, some disembodied guru. Who knows? But you could say maybe he never had a real guru in the sense of like a formal teacher. But when he met Ganapati Muni, who was one of the most intellectually gifted and most scholarly people of that time, he actually wanted to access the knowledge that Ganapati Muni had. So he had Upanishads read to him. He had like Tāntrik texts read to him. He was deeply curious and interested in what the Tantras and Upanishads had to say. He had never formally really studied them before, but after his spiritual awakening, he became really interested in them. Another example might be Sri Ramakrishna. He became deeply interested in religions after his awakening. So if you want to call that a second degree Shaktipata, you can. A third degree Shaktipata would be a person is so interested in spiritual life that that's all they ever do. That's their only interest in life. They're not at all interested in anything there is to gain in terms of wealth or in terms of power, in terms of pleasure. People like this maybe usually become ascetics, not always, but ascetic at least in their way of living, because they don't care for anything but spirituality. They only talk about spirituality. They only think about spirituality. From the moment they wake up, from the moment they go to sleep, all they ever do is spirituality. So their whole day is puja, is japa, is kirtan, is bhajan, like that. Every kind of spiritual activity they're interested in, and they typically engage in all kinds of spiritual activity throughout the day. And even when they go to sleep, they probably dream spiritual dreams. That person is so interested, so devoted. They might not be realized, but they're very quickly going to be. So that's the third degree. Everything from fourth to ninth degree is an increasing desire in the world, which is not bad. Again, these are all equally valid places to be in the experience of Pashutva. So if you have like a ninth degree Shaktipata, you will be spiritual, no doubt. But it kind of be like a hobby for you. It'll be some sort of thing that you're interested in, but also all these other things are interesting to you. And that's perfectly fine. So again, to Virupakshi's question, is a Pashu like always aware of its limitation? Yes, in some sense, physically at least, psychologically at least. In the spiritual sense, in the deeper sense, no, most aren't. Some are, and that's an all or nothing kind of thing. Either you have Shaktipata or you don't. That's why when it comes to Diksha, when the Guru wants to give a mantra, the Guru actually, according to some of our text, has to test for Shaktipata. They have to see whether or not that student actually is spiritual or just religious. And this is probably a lot of people now want mantra Diksha as part of their religious cultural obligation. They feel like as part of their Hindu religion, they ought to get Diksha, but they're not yet equipped for it because they don't yet have Shaktipata, which means they're not going to chant their mantra. At most, they'll do one round of the mala a day because that's what the Guru says. The Guru says, okay, like here's a mala, here's your mantra, at least do 108 repetitions a day of this mantra. So do one round of the mala. And they do that, because they're good. They're good people. They're good law-abiding people who want to do what they're told, and religion is what they were told. And they were also told that to be a Hindu, you have to get Diksha, and so they got it. But that doesn't mean that they're actually going to use that Diksha to realize God. It's just a cultural thing for them. So much of Diksha is just this cultural function that a priest executes that we, quote unquote, as Hindus just kind of opt into. Anyway, anecdote aside, much of what we do in religion, including Diksha, can just be for the sake of ceremony or culture. Therefore, the text, like the Malini Vijaya Uttara Tantra and various others, will list signs that help a teacher gauge Shaktipata in the student. And Shaktipata is the prerequisite for Shaktipat means descent of power or grace. That's the prerequisite for Diksha. Some people, because of Shaktipat, are initiated by Samvit Devi, the goddess of their own consciousness, and they're free forevermore. So it's not necessary that Shaktipat means Diksha, but often it does. In most cases, Shaktipat will mean, in the context of this tradition, a desire for Diksha. That means approaching the Guru. But the Guru ideally should not give a mantra until the Guru knows that the student has Shaktipat. And the Guru can assess that through a few different things that the tradition would list. For example, one of them is devotion to God. Maheshwara Bhakti or something like that. Is that person actually a devotee? Stuff like that, you know. Does that person demonstrate, like, basically, I'll boil all of this down to sincerity. Is that person actually sincerely trying to do this? Yearning, you know, we would say, pining, sincerity, like the quest comes from a recognition that what I have, no matter how much I gain in this world, will never be enough. And because I'm divinely discontented with this limitation and divinely inspired to pursue some unlimited bliss, I'm coming to you. That yearning, that eagerness is what the guru senses. It's like the guru picks up on a student's eagerness, and more importantly, the student picks up on the guru's eagerness to transmit. There's a kind of magnetic pull between the guru and the disciple, but only after Shaktipata. So depending on the intensity of the Shaktipata, we will seek different gurus, you know. So if the Shaktipata is very like weak, maybe you could say, not to say weak pejoratively, but if it's not a strong desire for God, then we would seek a guru maybe that's a little more lenient, or a guru that's a little less present, you know. So you get your mantra and you never see your guru again. That's how it is usually, culturally speaking. You go and get your mantra from this guru. You believe, oh, look, he's wearing some special cloth, or he's got some special title, so therefore, you know, he's got cultural authority to give me this mantra. So I go, he seems nice enough, she seems nice enough, they seem nice enough. Okay, I take my mantra, and now peace out. I'll never speak to that guru ever again. Because we're not actually interested in instruction, we're just interested in fulfilling a cultural role. But again, that's fine. You still got Diksha, and maybe that's because that Shaktipata was a lower grade one, like level 9 or 8 or 7 or something. But anywhere from like 6 to 4, you're interested in the world, that's perfectly fine. But you're also interested in sadhana. Just the amount of time that, an amount of energy that you devote to sadhana maybe is not as intense as someone with a level 4, level 3 Shaktipata, right? Like this way of discerning between different degrees of Shaktipata, not to say there are only 9, after all, 9 can be diversified in 27. You know, tivra, there's the idea of intense. Tivra can be understood as tivra, intensely intense, or madhya tivra, middle intense, or manda tivra, weakly intense. Then there's manda, which is weak. There's tivra manda also, intensely weak, or manda, the weakest one of all, level 9. So you can take 9, you can take 3, you can make it 9, you can make 9 into 27. In other words, there are infinite degrees between Shaktipatas. So like it's a spectrum. So to answer Virupakshi's question, is it like either spiritual or worldly? I would say no. We're all somewhere, I think, in between, insofar as we have Shaktipata. Because Shaktipata is, what do you call it? A spectrum, not discrete units or anything like that. But the word Shaktipata or grace is very important to understand paśu. Because a paśu, by definition, is any embodied soul functioning within time and space that is a knowing, willing, doing entity. And any willing, knowing, doing entity will necessarily come into contact with limitation. Limitation being a feature of this time-space reality. So they'll always try to overcome it. Whether it's a plant creeping around a wall to reach out for sunlight, or a human filling out job applications, all of this is done to overcome limitation. But you can go deeper and you can define a paśu. A real paśu is any being who recognizes that their limitation is on the level of the spirit, on the level of the soul, not on the level of the body and mind. So they're no longer interested, arguably, in overcoming those more superficial limitations. They're actually genuinely interested in overcoming their deepest limitation, the sense of separate self. So this is paśutva. Paśutva is actually ānavamala. Ānavamala is another technical phrase that we encounter in the Tantric world that means the stain, if you will, of actually individuality. If you think you're an individual, you're fucked, right? Like that's the claim. Because if you think you're an individual, you'll feel separate from every other individuals. You'll feel separate from the whole. That mala, that stain, anava mala, the impurity of individuality, is synonymous, I would argue, with paśutva. Paśutva, tva means ness, paśu means bound. So paśutva means bound animalness, boundness. So thank God we are all paśus. You know, thank God we have recognized our own paśutva. Because only then have we come to this lecture, have we come to this tradition, have we come to this practice. And the degree of intensity with which we take all of this up, with which we practice our mantra, that is determined by the level of Shaktipata that we have received. And God always knows what she's doing. So she gives everyone exactly what they would need to live the most meaningful and fulfilling life. So if you got a level 6 or 7 Shaktipata, but you try to live the life of someone who has a level 3 or 4 Shaktipata, it just won't seem honest or genuine. You'll burn out, or it just won't be sustainable, like that, you know? So everything should come from a place of ease and not a place of like judgment. Like, oh, I actually want to do other things. I don't want to sit and meditate all day. That's so bad. I better just force myself to sit and meditate all day. Although that's not what I want to do. No, don't do that. Live naturally. do as much of spirituality as you're interested in doing, but then also enjoy the world. This is the claim that we're making, that there's nothing wrong in that. It's all wonderful, actually. But we are saying that the degree of Shaktipata will determine the degree of intensity with which one takes up spiritual life. And the degree of intensity, as we see in the Yoga Sutra, is inversely proportional to the time that it takes to make gains or progress in spiritual life. So the more intensely you do something, the more quickly it happens for you, right? That's the argument. So if you do 10 malas over the course of 100 days, as opposed to 100 malas over the course of 10 days, we would argue then that in the latter case, one can make quicker progress. But be careful, if we do too much too soon, then one can also burn out. That's the interesting kind of play here. That's why it should feel natural. For a person with a strong Shaktipata, if they were to do 100 malas in 10 days, it would be difficult but doable. Their Shaktipata has determined that they have the interest for it. They have the, I would argue, appetite or the metal for it. But another person whose Shaktipata does not actually enable them to do 100 malas a day, if their guru were to tell them, now do 100 malas a day every single day, it would fry them out and it wouldn't be fun, it wouldn't be enjoyable, it wouldn't be a struggle in the meaningful sense. It would just be torture. Therefore, I am so deadly against standardizing the number of malas that a person should do in a day. I'm so against standardizing spiritual practice. How can you say this is how much practice you should do? Everyone will do different types of practices, and everyone will do a different amount of practice, and everyone will practice with a different intensity, and that's just how it should be. That's the beauty and play of everything. And animals, humans, it doesn't matter. As long as you're sentient, if you receive Shaktipata, you will be distinctly aware of your deepest limitation, here called pashutva or ānavopaya, and because of that, you will seek spirituality. Okay, so that's the first way we're going to define paśu. The paśu, or nara, we could say a person, and not limited to just humans, but a nara, a paśu, or an anu. Another word for this person is anu. And another word is, of course, jīva. So I want to distinguish all of these, anu, jīva, paśu, from the word ahankara, and we should also distinguish the word ahankara from the word purusha. But I think, those nuances aside, purusha is, I think, a different kind of it. Okay, let me just say this. It's a paśu in our tradition. Purusha in Sankhya is not a paśu. Okay, in Sankhya, they don't use the word paśu necessarily. In the Sankhyan philosophy, the word is jīva. And jīva is distinct from the purusha, actually. But purusha is an individual consciousness that's distinct from the mind and body. But it's different. The technical purusha has a technical connotation in Sankhya. These words, although they just mean like what they mean, they take on different flavors based on which philosophy you're speaking from. So speaking from the Shaiva philosophy, the word jīva, the word paśu, the word anu, and I'm just going to argue the word purusha can all be understood to be synonymously saying individual embodied being. Now, of course, purusha is not embodied in the sense that it's beyond prakriti, it's beyond the mind and the body, but it's still individuated. It's still distinct. And it's separate from all other purushas. And this Sankhya will admit. Sankhya, as you know, we've studied this before in different lectures. Sankhya argues that the purusha is the witness. And that witness consciousness, by the way, we're going to get into some deep stuff in just a few moments if you don't mind. I'm just defining a few terms. Consciousness, that witness consciousness is separate from what it witnesses. It's separate from the body, and it's also separate from the mind. So that means it's separate from who you think you are. Your sense of self even is not what you are. The one to whom your egoity or your sense of self occurs. The one who is aware of your personality, of your being. That one, that witness is called the purusha, and it's disembodied in a sense. But it's unique to you. You are a purusha. And so is Chris G, a purusha, and so is Theodore G, a purusha. We're all different purushas, and each of us, although we're beyond the body and mind, each of us are experiencing a different portion of prakriti. There's one prakriti, and we're all discrete purushas experiencing the one. So this purusha might be different from the jīva, and Sankhya is not very clear as to what the jīva actually is. But in any case, this purusha is free according to Sankhya. Purusha is the highest category in Sankhya. It's like category number 1 or category number 25. It's like the highest thing. It's really the absolute in the Sankhyan sense to recognize that you are Purusha and distinct from Prakriti. But in the Shaiva world, we add 11 more tattvas, which are actually now kind of explaining in an elliptical way. And so Purusha is not actually seen as the absolute. It's still a limited form of consciousness. It's consciousness plus Maya. It's consciousness plus some contraction, causing it to feel like a discrete unit. So for our purpose today, I'm going to define a sentient being as any being who is a willing, knowing, doing being. And that's another complexity. Purusha doesn't will or know or do. But in any case, sentient being is any being that is willing, knowing, and doing. More importantly, a sentient being is any being that is distinctly aware of its own limitation. And I would argue, in the deepest sense, a sentient being who is spiritually awakened is one who is aware of their spiritual limitations. And finally, we could say that a sentient being then is any being that's working to overcome that limitation. That's what it means to be a paśu. So it's praise, actually. It's praise to be a paśu, I would argue. And a purusha is a paśu in that there's one limitation, the primordial limitation, the illusion of separate self. Yes. So then this argument that like Shaktipata is, what do you call it? Singular. It either happens or it doesn't, but it has various degrees. Oh, and there's Rakta Rupini, Jaima, so good to see you here, Ma. I missed you. So she's saying, I feel like I need different intensity of practice at different times. So there is a really profound point. That like, wouldn't this contradict the statement that there is like Shaktipat and then there's like variety of different Shaktipatas, and if you get level 3, you'll just be really intense. But wait, even if you were really intense for like 2 years, you might need another year of like, resting and integrating, and then maybe we pick up our intensity again. So it does seem like there's a rhythm, there's a rhyme, but there's no rhyme or reason to that. Sorry, there's a rhythm, but there's no rhyme or reason to that rhythm. And sometimes we just need more practice, sometimes we need less practice. Here, I think we should. Here's a very important point. It's another nuance that Rakta Rupini is adding to this conversation. Notice, if nothing, Hinduism is all nuance. It's a deeply thought out tradition. So there's so many nuances, so intellectually refined. So here, let's add one more nuance. And actually, this is quite profound. The nuance of what intensity actually means. Because for us, I think we gauge it in terms of how much time we're spending. But you could spend all day in spiritual practice, but not really be present with your practices. So just because someone is sitting there and apparently meditating for 6 hours doesn't actually mean they're more intense than someone who sits down and meditates for 30 minutes, for whom those 30 minutes were clear, lucid concentration. So time loses its validity as a metric for intensity. It's better than nothing. It does at least indicate priorities. If a person is willing to sit down for 6 hours, obviously they're prioritizing meditation. But are they? Because they could just be escaping other things, So it gets really complicated when it comes to how do we gauge intensity. It's not so easy. It's not really what happens on the physical plane, nor is it even what happens on the psychological plane, because even that varies, like resting is part of intensity as much as working really hard, because the time when you're resting is the time when you're integrating. So someone who's working really hard might not be intense because you're not taking the time to integrate. So therefore, we would say intensity is so deep, actually. It's deeper than even what our day-to-day schedules look like. That's the next level of nuance, where intensity has to do with the soul's yearning. So I would argue, even when that yearning seems to fade, what is being experienced here actually is on the level of the mind and the body. And what's being claimed is that the gunas, which we're going to come to soon, sattva, rajas, and tamas, are changing. So at times, there's more sattva guna. We are more intense about spiritual life. At other times, because of various factors, of course, Rakta Rupini, Ruby Devi is like an expert in astrology. So if ever, by the way, you guys want to do anything astrology related, that's your girl. Like, she's the one to go to. But as she will tell you, there's so many factors astrologically that would affect what a person feels at any given moment, which will affect how their spiritual life is enacted. So there are astrological factors. Of course, those are tied into dietary things, into societal things. Maybe somebody just moved. Maybe you're living in a place where there are many spiritual practitioners around you that might motivate you. So there's all these different factors that can affect how you feel your intensity. But I don't think it actually changes that intensity. I think it changes the experience of your intensity and actually the way that you manifest that intensity. But that intensity, we would argue, is going to be innate post the Shaktipata. Okay, how did we do at reconciling that? So hopefully you can see Shaktipata is very nuanced. In one sense, it's all or nothing. Either you have it or you don't. In another sense, there are degrees. And in yet another sense, the degrees of intensity are pointing to a much deeper yearning, a much deeper intensity than just that can be gauged on the level of action. And you can never lose it. That's the thing. You can lose your consistency, but that doesn't mean you lose your intensity. You can lose your state of peace and joy and fulfillment, which after all is a mental state. You can only lose your mind, never your intensity. And it's your intensity that will take you beyond the mind. So the claim that we're making is that an individual might experience spirituality in different ways, and the practice will fluctuate, just like our mental state fluctuates, just like our physical health fluctuates. For example, last night, I'm breathing so well, nicely, talking for hours. This morning, can barely get a breath in. Where's that coming from? The gunas, the play of the gunas. Maybe there's more tamo guna in the body. the lungs have mucus in them, the thick coating of some kind of soot from all the smoke. Maybe that's tamoguna. You could argue it that way. Or, you could argue astrologically, maybe my something in Gemini is being afflicted. Or something like you could argue, like make claims that like, oh, like skin is breaking out. Maybe something's going on in Pisces. Maybe there's a Mars transit that's like causing some aggravation. Like there are factors astrologically, which of course refer to internal experiences, gunas, all of that, which will change how my practice looks. But wait, that doesn't change the Shaktipata. The fact of the Shaktipata remains. So to Nitya Leela's question, can you lose Shaktipata? No, never. You can lose states, naturally, because the mind is changing. You can, lose consistency. You can fall back in terms of your practice. You can make strides, but like you will never lose your Shaktipata. And so you'll never lose your Pashutva. It's a wonderful thought, actually, that once you're in, you're in. Once you've come to spiritual life, no matter what that looks like over the course of however many years, even if you leave it alone for a little while, it will bring you back. Just you see, there are some people who just leave it all behind for a little while. Over the years, after doing this for some time now, I've noticed this. Some people just like step away for years, but they almost always come back. In one way, shape, or form, something almost always brings them back to spiritual life. So you can run, but you can't hide. Mother will find you wherever you go, and your yearning, your Shakti path will sort of determine your path and how it looks. And it will determine that you are on the path. Though, of course, that path will look different at different times. Okay, putting all that together now, we have, I think, a nice definition of paśu, right? Nara or paśu, paśutva. So paśu or jīva or nara or anu, individual, is any being that feels itself to be a limited, discrete individual. And we would go further, is that being who, having felt this as a result of grace, is determined to overcome it on every level, but primarily on the spiritual level. So this already teaches you what spiritual life is about. We define spiritual life as the journey from Pashutva to Shivatva. And by Shiva, we don't mean a blue guy sitting on a meditation mat. I'm going to come to the definition of Shiva in a few moments because I'm going to say it's Kali, as you'll see in a bit. But for now, it's just the quest for the absolute. We're just going to call it, let's not call it Shiva now, let's just call it Purnahangta. Purnahangta means the complete I amness. Aham means I am, Purna means full or whole. Twa means nas. So Purna Hamta means the complete I amness. Now I'm actually having Vishesha Hamta, like a special I amness. Can we put it that way? Visheshosti. I feel like I am an individual embodied soul. And special in the sense that I'm different from you, different from the rock, different from everyone else. Like that feeling is where I am now, and we can acknowledge it. In fact, acknowledging it itself is part of grace, is part of our sentient existence, to acknowledge that I am, and that I am limited. So I am, and I am discrete, and I am separate, and I am limited, and that's wonderful. And now I sense that I want to overcome that primordial limitation, that pashutva or that ānavamala. So I engage in a series of practices that will then take me to the absolute. And by the absolute, I mean the sense that I am the I am that doesn't have the ability to say I am not. So if you can say I am, and there's no line that you can draw that separates that I am from any other I am, you've done it. You're a wizard, Harry. If you've attained this, then you've attained everything the tradition has to offer. The complete sense of self. That is happiness. Nothing else will bring you happiness. Nothing else will fulfill you, we claim, until you have this sense of I am in all things, as all things. So the most complete realization in this tradition is the most complete sense of self, which we're just calling Purnahamta for now. Okay. Now, let me make an even more important point, if you don't mind, in terms of practice. So all of this, this is just technical, philosophical kind of stuff, like to explain what a paśu is. But now, what does that mean for us? Yes, we feel like we're pashus. So therefore, there's a specific kind of approach in Tantra, a specific practice that appeals to and applies to those who sense their pashutva. We call this the ānavopaya. Ānava means anu. Ānava means like the one for the anu, actually. Anu again, the word actually, anu, what it means atom. Isn't that a beautiful idea? Atom is a discrete particle of matter. So anu is a discrete particle of consciousness. How about that? Isn't that nice? So anu means unit of first person awareness. And that's what I feel myself to be. Let's be honest, don't we feel that way? I mean, if you do feel that way, ānavopaya is going to be really good. If you feel like a person distinct from other people, in other words, let me put it this way. If you feel like you're here and everyone else is over there, that's pashutva. We feel our individuality, and most of us do, and that's wonderful. So therefore, the practice that we should engage in, according to the Malini Vijaya Uttara Tantra, is called ānavopaya. Ānavopaya is the individual embodied means, which is to say, it's a practice that acknowledges this reality. So feeling like I'm an individual, therefore, it makes sense to be a devotee of God. Because as an individual, I'm distinct from other individuals, but I'm also distinct from whatever it is that I call God. So therefore, any kind of bhakti, devotional prayer practice to God, conceived of as a being, is ānavopaya. Because it acknowledges my individuality as separate from God, and it acknowledges God's individuality as separate from me. And therefore, spiritual life proceeds on this assumption. Right? So I'm going to continue on this line. Let me just see what Daryl G has to say here. So Daryl G is saying, sorry if this is crude. Daryl, if anything was crude, like I would have to give that disclaimer before any lecture. If I'm anything, it's crude. But essentially, so don't worry about it. Be at ease. But essentially, are you claiming one's Shaktipat can only increase? No, it doesn't increase or decrease. It just is. And doesn't necessarily decrease, but can seemingly become occluded through the play of the gunas. In experience. So you might, as a result of the gunas, experience your Shakti path to be increasing or decreasing, but it's not the kind of thing that increases or decreases. It's just the recognition of limitation. The degree of that recognition can decrease or increase, you could say, yes. So that would mask, yes, our understanding. And that Shaktipat represents making us think our intensity has vanished, but really it's just more complex or subtle. Yeah, I think that's it. It's a more complex or subtle expression of that Shaktipat, integrating or expressing in a way that just appears to be a decrease in intensity. Exactly right. It was worded wonderfully, actually. So he's saying, Daryl J is saying, basically Shaktipat can never dilute or decrease. Rather, we may just go through experiences that seem to mask its intensity or flavor temporarily. That was beautifully put, Daryl G. That's exactly right, I think. So again, when we talk about degrees, increasing, decreasing, we're really talking on the relative plane of the mind and body, which is in terms of our experience of one absolute unchanging fact. What is that fact? I am, and I am limited. That recognition. Everybody recognizes that they are, but not everyone recognizes that they are limited. Actually, we'll go further. We say everyone, including the spider, recognizes that it is and that it is limited. But the degree to which it recognizes that it's limited, that degree, of course, will change from being to being. And we say the moment you realize you are spiritually limited, the moment you sense your ānavamala or paśutva, then only you start spiritual life. So the dichotomy is, are you in spiritual life or aren't you? And it doesn't mean, do you belong to religion or don't you? Are you practicing or are you not? It's not that. Are you actually trying to do something here? Are you actually trying to accomplish some fulfillment that you sense is possible through this life, through this path? And if yes, then that's either yes or no. But of course, now we further complicate the issue or add nuance to the issue by saying that like Shaktipat comes in many flavors. There's degrees to that recognition. And does that change over time? Maybe. Maybe now we're starting to like lean into a more relative way of speaking about Shaktipat insofar as we're starting to acknowledge these degrees. Maybe that means we can acknowledge that these degrees are going to change. But I want to make a nuanced claim here that like the degree of Shaktipata will be arguably the same for the rest of this life, but that too can be experienced on levels of degree. So if I'm like level 3 Shaktipata, there are degrees to how I'll experience that. So while there are degrees to Shaktipata, there are also going to be changing and fluctuating degrees in my embodied experience of my Shaktipata on the level of the body and mind. But that Shaktipata is not on the level of the body and mind. Therefore, it is not subject to increase or decrease. Does that make sense? It's a very complicated and very nuanced subject. It's one of the most nuanced topics, actually, grace. Abhinavagupta has a whole text, the Malini Vijaya Vartika. Wait, no, is it? No. Anyway, there's a big section in Ishvara Pratyabhigya Vivritti Vimarshani, and anyway, that deals with this complex topic of grace. It's very complex, but basically we're saying the soul is not subject to change. It just is, and therefore Shaktipat, because on the level of the soul, is also not subject to change. So the 9 degrees or 27 degrees of Shaktipat, that will be discrete, that shouldn't change. But yes, whatever you get as a result of grace, again, if you could change that, that wouldn't be grace. Like if you could increase your Shaktipata, then it's not grace anymore. Grace is on God's side. So God gives grace on the level of Shaktipata, but that level will be determined by God. You cannot change that level. That's a very deep point, actually. But you can, arguably, through your actions on the level of the body and mind, alter the experience of that level. So 3 levels of nuance here. Shaktipata is all or nothing. Let's soften that by saying it's 9 different things. Those won't change. For the rest of your life, you'll have what you have. But then let's soften that by saying, but that thing that you have, whatever that is, that will change. as you go through your life. So you can even add degrees. Anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked in a discussion on Shaktipata. It's a beautiful conversation, and we've had it many times in other places and on different occasions. Let me just come back to this ānavopaya thing. This is going to be important for us, especially moving into Kali Puja and all that. So ānava means individual or embodied. Upaya, this very important word, it means means or technique. By the way, do you know the word yoga comes from the root yuk? Yuj. And it's one of the oldest roots in Sanskrit, actually. It's a very, there's like a series of roots, dhatus, that are so ancient, and yuj is one of them. And you might be very thrilled to know that it's synonymous with the English word use, to use something. To use something is to yuj. And yuj means yoga, actually. Yoga is one of the ways you can get something from the root. Yoga means something you use. It means so many different things, obviously. It can mean a union, it can mean a conjunct. An astrological conjunct can be called a yoga. So if like Mars is conjuncting another planet, you call that yoga. You can say Shani, Mangal, yoga. The conjunct of one planet and another. Or you could tie your boat to a pole and that would be called a yoga. You know, sex can be called a yoga. A yogini might be one who is in sex with Bhairava, with Shiva. So again, any combination of things can be called yoga. Yoga can also be called a state in which the mind is wholly attenuated. Yogas, chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga Sutra defines yoga not necessarily as a practice, nor even as a joining of two things. Rather, it's actually the disjoining of two things. The recognition that I, Purusha, am not Prakriti. So based off a Sankhyan model, what we get in the Yoga Sutra is a definition of yoga that is unique, which is the mind, when it's completely blank, is yoga. Yoga is the complete attenuation of the mind. That's yoga. But generally, for general use, yoga just means a way, a technique, something that you use. So bhakti yoga, the way of bhakti, or the technique of bhakti, bhakti being devotion. Karma yoga, the way of action. So here yoga doesn't refer necessarily to the state, but to the means whereby that state is attained. So it comes from the Sanskrit root yuj, which just like English means use, to use. You know, yoga is something that you use. It's yuj. It's something you use in order to get spiritual things. Not necessarily spiritual things. It can also be something you use to get worldly things. No problem there either. So with that in mind, upaya is synonymous with yoga. Upaya means way or technique or means or method. So ānavopaya means the method that is appropriate for the individual. The one who feels themselves to be an individual will profit from ānavopaya. And that's like most of us, right? Like most of us will feel as individuals. So therefore, Malini Vijaya Uttara Tantra starts with this. They start with ānavopaya, and they give a slew of different kinds of ānavopayas, primarily puja. Puja is the ritualistic worship of a deity, and I was talking about this at great length last night. So last night we talked about getting started with Kali Puja, and I recommended going out and purchasing at least a picture, and if not a picture, if not a murti, right? Like a picture is a two-dimensional image of the deity, but as we were saying yesterday, you could also get a three-dimensional image, whatever size you want, and then set that up on altar in the north of your house, ideally. And then now you have a deity. Then I was telling you yesterday that if you put aside all these non-dual, like absolute ideas about God being pure non-dual consciousness in everything and as everything, which I'm going to talk about just in a few moments. But like, if we put all of that aside, very basically, your job now is to see the living presence of Kali in the Murti. Before you can see it anywhere else in the world. And it's true, everything is nothing but Kali. You're only ever seeing Kali. There's never been anything that we've seen that is not Kali, that is not the goddess. But for the purposes of puja, for ānavopaya, we act as if, and it should feel very natural to act in this way actually, that there's some other being called Kali, a deity. God in the traditional sense of the word, God as a being different and distinct from this being, which I feel myself to be. So now the whole thing is about relating. It's about relating to that being. So therefore, we perform puja, a very refined and sophisticated ritual modality to worship that being. So I was saying yesterday that the whole thing rests upon this axiom that there is a being called Kali. She is an energy. And that energy can be brought into the image through the process of prana pratishta or through the process of puja. So if every day you're doing puja, especially if you're doing that specific ritual called prana pratishta or pratisthapana, the prana sthapana means to establish the energy of Kali in the murti. If you do that ritual, the working assumption of puja, I would even argue the faith that we have, is that there is Kali there in the image. So when we see the image, we bow. We speak to the image as we are speaking to somebody else. Sri Ramakrishna would test this You know, he felt the image to be alive in a unique way. So he would put like something under the image's nose to see whether or not she was breathing. Some people have had visionary experiences where the image will blink and move and speak, things like that. But notice, while anything in the world can be seen as a murti of Kali, in ānavopaya, we designate one thing as the murti, our murti. So in the temple, all rocks are Shiva, but not all rocks are the lingam that is bathed every day. Do you notice? Isn't that interesting? Now, spiritually, metaphysically, philosophically, all rocks are Shiva. Like everything is the one reality. God cannot be limited to any idol. So that's why it's not quite idol worship, but it isn't not that. It's not idol worship, right? Because we are worshiping an idol, but it's not idol worship in the sense that we don't actually think God is the idol. Like the idol is not already God. Like actually something has to be done. Daily puja, and if you want to be even more traditional, prana sthapana, like all of those things have to be performed in order to potentize, or let's use more folk language here, possess the idol. So when you're in sadhana with others, the idol is not the only thing that can be possessed. The body too, as an idol, can be possessed. And therefore, the goal of our sadhanas actually is to be possessed by Kali, which of course has its roots in a more, I'm going to use this word, shamanic, or tribal, but I don't mean it in the pejorative sense. I much prefer the more, I think, politically correct word autochthonous, because autochthonous might mean indigenous in a more respectful way. It just means those practices that are not necessarily urban or that are maybe older and maybe come prior to the Vedic period, etc., etc. But those practices can be very orgiastic, can be very ecstatic, can be very power-seeking, can sometimes be somewhat immoral in the eyes of urban society, and therefore they often have a bad rep. And often they have to do with working with spirits, and those spirits sometimes are brought into the body, and then you can speak to your dead, or you can speak to disembodied beings that can then give you lottery ticket numbers, etc., etc. You know, like there's this whole thing has a bit of a bad rep, but it is the foundation of so much of Tantra, and it's re-included in the Tantric world and in the Tantric language. So even at the highest levels of our tradition, the most aristocratic brahmanas like Abhinavagupta, who are commenting on this text from the most absolute non-dual point of view, even they will use words like aveśa. Aveśa means possession. And aveśa, when Abhinavagupta speaks of it, he gives it a very interesting turn. He refines it to mean absorption in Shiva, immersion in the one non-dual reality that is in all things as all things. To possess, to be possessed is to possess, because possession works both ways. Possession means I am possessed, but it also means I possess. So possession can be understood in so many different ways. But look, basically though, the word aveśa has a range. There's Abhinavagupta on one end, defining it as that, but then he's also including, I think, by his choice of word, the more folk or autochthonous understanding of actually being taken over by the deity. And the eyes change, you know. You should see Crystal Devi, Dakini Devi, when she's dancing. You know, it's a different, like something changes. The face changes, the eyes are wider, and you sense the power and presence of a being in that body. So the goal then of our sadhanas, the reason why we dance, the reason why we chant, the reason why, arguably, in some versions of the tradition, we ingest intoxicants, is also that we can become susceptible to possession. In some cases, you dress the part. If you want to be possessed by a deity, you should dress like the deity. You know, wear your hair like the deity does. That's why in some text it says you should always have your hair wild and free when you do Kali Puja. Because if you want to be possessed by Kali, then you should look like Kali, and that means that your hair shouldn't be bound, because her hair is never bound, you know. So if you have long hair, in the case that you do, you should have it be wild and free. A text, Karpuradi Sutram, would also argue that when you do Kali Puja, of course, follow the laws in your country, and more importantly, follow social cues and things like that. Maybe don't leave this one for something you do privately. But it says that you should do it totally naked, divested of all clothes. Because Kali is totally naked. So you shouldn't wear any clothes when you're meditating on Kali. But again, it's not something that it's not something you pull out when you're in presence of others, I think. It's a private practice. So when I did my prana pratishtha for Kali, it was in the middle of the night. It was just me. So I could just like sit here and be naked and be with Ma, you know, like it's no problem. But if I'm going to do a big public puja, I mean, come on. You know, like, so these rules are there, but like, again, be discerning. So one should, when worshipping Kali, have their hair wild and free. They should be naked. When they worship Kali, they should worship Kali in the cremation ground, because that's where she lives. Once, an Agori Baba had given me a mundamala. And then he gave it to me and he said, the way he said it was so interesting. He said, don't let anybody see you wear it. And I love that advice, because sometimes a lot of this can become cosplay. And that's fine too, but that's not the purpose. Arguably, the purpose is deeper. It's more than just aesthetic, although that's beautiful. The aesthetics are beautiful and they can be enjoyed in their own right. But here, the purpose is not to like make a show or impress others and dress the part and not act the part. It's not that. So his advice was interesting. He said, here's a necklace of skulls. And then he said, don't show it to others and put it on when you need a boost, when you're meditating in the smashan at night. It's an interesting point, but I can see where he's coming from, because if you put on the mundamala, now that's one more thing that relates you to the goddess. And often some of you who have come and seen me perform Homa, there is always going to be on one side a trident. And the trident is tied with a particular black cloth dipped in particular substances that would be important for that deity. And next to the trident, there is a kapala. So very rarely will I perform rituals as part of our lineage without my trident and without my kapala, because these are emblems of Kali, of Bhairava, of Kapalini, and of Bhairava. So without imitating Kali and Bhairava to some extent, I am not as susceptible to being possessed by Kali and Bhairava as I otherwise might be if I turn this body into a murti. Do you see the logic here? It's very interesting. It's totally devotional. It's not a non-dual claim here. We think that the deity is actually something other than us. It is an embodied individual that recognizes itself as the deity. So Kali knows she's Kali, just as Nishant knows he's Nishant. And the two are different, actually. In this world of embodied beings, I'm an Anu and she's like a special kind of Anu. She's a Vishesha Purusha. She's a special spirit. And she is the God. God is that being who creates, maintains, and destroys. So to worship God, already, like I was saying last night, comes with the implied sense of being separate from God, as at least God's devotee, God's worshipper. But now, notice, it's very interesting. It's hard for God to possess bodies. Why? Because we have all of our own hang-ups. So that's why another secret in sadhana. You cannot worship Kali if you're full of fear. Why? Because then she can't possess you. The idea is that unless you resonate with her on a psychological level, it doesn't matter what clothes you wear. So a person could dress like Kali, but they're dressing the part, they're not playing the part. Another person could be completely bald, covered in all the clothes, looking nothing like Kali. They're more likely to be possessed by Kali. Why? Because it's not so much about what you dress like, though that can be helpful. It's really quite superficial. The real thing is how you feel. So when you dress like Bhairava, you have to feel like Bhairava. In other words, if you walk around with a trident and a kapala, you cannot at the same time flinch at notions of pure or impure. And more importantly, you cannot flinch every time you hear a sound in the smashan, like as if you're afraid of some wild animal or some ghost or something like that. You can't be afraid of ghost and then still claim to be Bhairava. If you're not willing to go to the smashan alone at night and sit in the jungle there by yourself all night long while there are all these sounds around you, then it doesn't matter what you wear, because Bhairava, the one who practices in this way, feels fearless, has virabhav, so when you're worshipping Kali, you have to feel like Kali. Only then can Kali really possess you. But it's hard to feel like Kali and Bhairava, because what would that look like? It would look like intense joy and bliss. It would look like freedom. It would look like uninhibited, dare I even say unhinged freedom, madness, joy, fearlessness. How few of us are truly fearless? How few of us are truly uninhibited? We all have our inhibitions. And how few of us are truly free? That's the thing. We're all of us on some level inhibited, bound. We each have our own metrics for pure and impure, not necessarily the Brahmanical ones, but they're there, based on our own unique cultural and psychological conditioning. So because of that, it's hard for us to be possessed by Kali. So much of the practice is just opening ourselves up for the possession of aveśa event. So what do you call it? This idea of make a way in the wilderness for the coming of the Lord. I love that. In the Bible, there's that line, make a way in the wilderness for the coming of the Lord. So the Lord Jesus Christ wants to come. So do I, honestly. The Holy Spirit wants to come in this orgasmic release. It's coming. But here's the problem. We haven't made a way in the wilderness for him to come. Like, how will he come? Like, he wants to come, but he can't because there's no space. The wilderness, you could say, is the samsara of samskara. It's like in our minds, we have all of these hangups, we have all of these problems. Until those are purified and cleared out, we will not be a vessel that can hold that energy even. So it can't flow through us. Therefore, a human body is one of the best places for God to manifest. So God will animate the human body, speak through the human body. I've seen crazy things. I've seen very small girls, small frame, pick up huge men and throw them across the clearing, a feat that she could never have accomplished if she was not in that state. I've seen people swallow the burning karpura, speak in voices that are not their own, speak in languages that they don't know. It's remarkable. Eye colors will change, like all of these things. come from a world which we Malayalis know all about. In Kerala, even in Gujarat, there's like kind of this tradition. In some of the Caribbean islands where there's a big Hindu diaspora, there's also a bit of emphasis on things like this. So this is kind of a tantric world of possession and spirit worship and whatnot. Those who have practiced some hoodoo or voodoo or Santeria or even African diaspora religions of other kinds, there's an overlap, you know. Exactly. And I would even argue, as Rakta Rupini is pointing out, it's kind of Pentecostal Tantra, Pentecostal Hinduism, because, you know, there's a lot of ecstasy. And therefore, as we can also realize, it can also be really dangerous in the sense that there might be a lot of drug use, a lot of sentimentality that's not grounded and therefore dangerous to oneself and to others. And above all, the worst thing arguably is pretense, hypocrisy, right? So often in these spaces where things can be very performative, because there's an emphasis on ecstasy and external manifestation of ecstasy, you also see people putting things on. You know, therefore the outfits can become ridiculous. People are dressing the part, but they're not feeling the part, or they're playing the part, but not actually buying into that role. So you get a lot of like, you know, hypocrisy, pretense, but just because there are imitations doesn't mean there isn't the real thing. You know, the very fact that there are imitations means they're imitating something real. And what it means really to worship Kali is ultimately to become Kali. But let's talk about it now in a dualistic sense. From the ānavopaya point of view, that is from the view of the Anu. Yes, exactly. The Anu, the individual who feels herself to be different, works very hard through practices like puja and other things to become possessed by the deity, to become the deity in the sense that the deity is a separate energy that is now invited into this body so that I can commune with that deity in a much more direct and personal way. So you could do this with Kali, but also we do this with yoginis and stuff, yoginis and dakinis. So they are Ma Kali's retinue. Even Bhairava is not understood as just Bhairava, but also the Ashta Bhairavas and their flock of excellent yogis. So in the smashan, I mean, what is in a smashan? There are dakinis, there are dakas, and there are all sorts of spirits, vetalas, pishachas, bhutas. A big part of this part of Tantra is to do pujas to invite them to come into the body, actually. And because then once you're possessed by them, they will confer not only knowledge but power. So the Kapalika tradition of bringing deities into the body by pleasing them through puja in order, arguably, to acquire power and knowledge, either for power's sake or for some worldly outcome or for spiritual liberation, that's what we call the ānavopaya, or the embodied approach, that is so central to Tantra. And hopefully you can see how this goes nicely with last night's talk, right? Because I was just like making a case for doing Kali Puja as an Anu, as a paśu, as an individual embodied soul. And you can still practice oneness with God, but in this sense of aveśa. So it might not be permanent, you know, it might be something that happens for an hour or two, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, but our lives will be forever changed, arguably, by having contacted the deity in such an intimate way. I would argue Swami Vivekananda practiced this a lot because he would come to this country, and anytime he started giving a talk, something would change. You know, his voice would change, his understanding would deepen. He knew things that maybe he didn't know. He was able to see further than he otherwise would have seen. He spoke as if from a different place than his own personal charisma. You know, something was flowing through him. And therefore, when he finished his lecture, sometimes he would say, I don't know what happened. You know, he would claim that he was, you know, in the modern language, channeling. He just felt like he just blanked out. The lecture happened. And then he came to. He was like, oh, what? You know, so there's a claim here that everything you have ever heard Swamiji say, Kali said through him. And he admitted that to Sister Nivedita. He said that he had no will of his own. Why? Because he wasn't even aware of himself in these moments, because Kali had totally possessed him. So I would even argue this might not be desirable. There are great Shaiva masters who speak against possession, you know. So for instance, possession is considered the goal of some traditions. Here's the pushback. Here's the counter. Isn't the goal moksha, freedom? And isn't freedom defined as agency or like self-awareness? Possession takes all of that away. Possession takes away your freedom because it sublates your agency. Why does it sublate your agency? Because it negates your self-awareness. So it's possible if you invite Kali into the body, you have to get out of the way. And whatever she does in your body, you might not know anything about it. And then later you come to her and you're like, oh, fuck. You know, and what, like 2 hours have gone by and then like you don't really remember what happened. Is that really moksha? No, take drugs instead then. You know, just take some ketamine or something. Like if you want to just like zone out of the body, here's some Xanax, you know. I wouldn't have popped the Xans if I knew you all had made plans. No more parties in LA. Please, baby, no more parties in LA. So like, there are easier ways to just Audi 5 thou, you know. But this is kind of like that in one sense. And that's why some great Shaiva masters argue this cannot be the goal. You Kapalikas with your cremation ground rituals, invoking all of these spirits, they're kind of chaotic neutral anyway. You can't even say they're chaotic bad. I mean, you can't say they're chaotic good. Some of these, like, I don't know, maybe they also want things from you. They might take advantage of you, pose as what they're not. Like, it's a dangerous and weird world, and like people get into trouble and they go crazy and they end up doing things they later regret. And what to say of all the hypocrisy and pretense and performance that we find in this world, and what to say of all the sentimentality leading to self-harm and the harm of others. And it's all so messy that some Shaiva masters are like, look, it's real, but that's not what we mean by moksha. Because by moksha, we mean agency, and agency requires self-awareness. And this takes those two things away. It takes away your ability to act because someone is now acting through you. Kali is now acting through you. And it takes away your, in one sense, self-awareness. So how can that be moksha? And Swamiji would say, Mother Kali made a slave of me. Does that sound like freedom? He became her slave, you know? And the way he described it was so stunning. It was so beautiful. He said to Sister Nivedita, I would highly recommend this book. It's called The Master as I Saw Him by Sister Nivedita. And all throughout her collected works, I haven't read the whole thing, but in the collected works of Sister Nivedita, she dropped these like little like anecdotes about what Swamiji said to her in private that are just like, you know, you get the public facing dignified Swamiji with the turban and the, but then you also get Swamiji the mystic, the mad lover of Kali. Hey, Rakta Rupini, Jai Ma, so good to see you, Ma. Hey, are you coming? I hope you guys will come all to LA October 20th. Come for Kali Puja, please. Come. Okay, no, we'll talk about it. But this idea of possession, Swamiji admitted arguably to Sister Nivedita from time to time that Kali would possess him, you know? So he would say like, you know, he confessed also to another one of his disciples that he would try to lie down to get a bit of rest. He wasn't allowed. Something would push him out of the bed. He felt his Kundalini Shakti, which we argued is one and the same with Kali, that Kula Kundalini would push him out of the bed and force him to work. So, and then he said to Sister Nivedita, he said, many of the things that happened, he claimed would go with him to his grave. But he gave the impression that he was speaking to Kali, the way you would speak to a person, you know? And he claimed that she told him, I will make a slave out of you. And then he said to Sister Nivedita, she saw her chance and took it. She saw how desperate I was, how destitute I was, how willing I was, etc. And she saw her opportunity and she took it. He's almost framing her in this kind of like manipulative way where she wants a slave, she wants someone to do her will in the world. And she saw Swamiji was not only capable, but he was down bad. At that time, he was actually down bad. And so maybe playfully, maybe humorously, maybe somewhat darkly, depending on your predisposition, Swamiji said to Sister Nivedita that Kali saw her chance and took it and made a slave out of me. This is exactly what Christians are terrified of, right? They're afraid that like some dark god will be summoned in the puja and then take away your agency and then enact her will in the world. Once Vijay and I had a nice laugh. We were driving home from the temple. We were talking about aveśa experiences and all that. And we just had a really nice laugh because like my favorite thing is just for a moment, just like thinking if everything the evangelical Christians say is true. Like that would really be funny and wonderful. Like it would be surprising. So my joke is when I die, the only thing that would surprise me is it's actually the Christian God. And he's like, fuck, you're a good guy and all. You had a good chance, but you're going to have to go to hell. And I'm like, oh, wow, that was real? And then he's like, yeah, I tried to tell you. Don't you know? I was everyone in your comment threads. I was Goku_27 telling you to repent and accept the Christ. I sent so many boats. Like I sent everyone to tell you that I'm the one true God. Jesus is the one true way. Your religion is totally devil worship. And like everything you've been doing is wrong. And you're a good guy too. So I try to help you. But fuck, I'm God. And I have to send you to eternal hell now. So that would be funny to me. Like I'd be like, oh man. So then I was also joking with Vijay. I was like, let's just accept that there is God like in the Christian sense. And like just accept there's a devil. It's perfectly possible that that's just what happened to me, that I'm just like possessed by the devil and this is the devil enacting his chaotic will in the world by telling women that they're strong and powerful and they should do whatever they want. And like now to empower women, to tell people that the world is holy, that it's okay to pursue their pleasures. That sounds like something the devil would say. And that's exactly what we say in our tradition, you know? So I'm like, yeah, maybe that's just that. Maybe there is a devil. Maybe it's Kali. And maybe the devil, Kali, and Vaishnavas think that too, like Kali lives in hell, etc. Maybe the devil, and by the way, it's not only Christians that would say Kali is the devil. Some Vaishnavas will also say she's the devil. The devil, Kali, somehow contacted us through our rituals and has now possessed us and is making us say all of these things and is imbuing us with the demonic energy to spread her message in this world for the sake of increasing the amount of chaos, to sublate the good, joy, harmony, sattva, etc. I'm open to that. If so, whatever. I don't have a say in it anymore. If I am in the legions of Lucifer, then well, that's that. I'll have to take my punishment because what can I do? I'm sold. So that's the claim. Like, this is a fear. This is a real fear. It's not just a fear that Christians have. It's a fear that many people in the Hindu world have. Brahmanas have this fear. It's like, why would I go to the smashan and invite the possession, invite this experience? I mean, what if something comes in and doesn't want to leave, or what if I do something I don't want to do? I am terrified, the Brahmana would say, of losing autonomy, of losing agency, of giving my body and mind to something other, something foreign that I don't really even understand. That terror is a very important thing to acknowledge. And that's one of the reasons why people have kept away from this type of practice, in India, especially in the Indic context. Now, coming to Nitya Leela's point, there is this interesting idea that this is a form of freedom, to give your head, heart, and body to the divine, to be a slave to God, to be God's servant is the highest freedom in the world. Because as Bob Dylan, the great sage of this country, the Rishi of America, has said, you got to serve somebody, right? And it's a question of like, who are you going to serve? Because if you don't serve God, or Kali, insofar as they are different, then you'll serve your body, you'll serve your mind. No one is free. A person who is an atheist who rejects God is free to think, but what will they think about? Food and sex? Here's the thing, a person who is trying to be free in this world will very soon realize that the freedom that they're talking about is really just the freedom to be a slave to their impulses, a slave to their ego, to their body, to their mind. No one is really free. Everyone is being possessed by something. So the question now is by what? And here we're saying, yeah, like to be possessed by God is real freedom. To give your mind and body and heart to God, that's what freedom looks like. But for the mind and body, it's slavery. The mind and body are made the slaves of God, the servants of God. That is where we find our freedom, actually. That's the claim, right? So there's a joy to it, a limitlessness in it, and it becomes very addictive. But the people who do it, by the way, if they're not prepared, their body gets very ill. The body can't hold that energy. So after they get possessed, in these rituals, sometimes they become very ill, or their lives are usually kind of like problematic because they become kind of psychologically destabilized, right? Um, so I'm just like looking through the comments really quickly. Yeah, or as Corey will point out, I don't know, there's all these things, that could happen that there's a risk, right? But therefore, we want to be clear about what kind of spirits we're talking about here. Like that's why the puja is so protected. There's so many things that you do to prevent like something you don't want. So to Gretchen Ma's question, it's like, yeah, there are all sorts of beings, right? And they sometimes pose as something they're not. So many of the quote unquote like cases of spirit possession, the spirit almost always presents itself as someone else. I have two examples. I'll pause the recording. Anyway, that's a well-known thing, right? There are spirits who present themselves to be something other than what they are. Therefore, people shouldn't dabble with this who don't know what they're doing. And so guru is important, lineage is important, and the ritual itself has inherent checks and balances, as you will see as you study the puja, that prevent this sort of thing, so that the entering of energy is Kali only and not any other, kind of thing. But then also you can be intentional. I know people who specifically work with Vetalas. I myself have done some pujas like that. And it works actually. If you have the address of a particular spirit, you can call that spirit. That's why skulls are important. We use skulls kind of as a way to like interact with spirits, and having the skull is like having a phone. And then you just need the right mantras. And then you can interact with Vetalas for a variety of reasons. Some of them not so savory, others quite beautiful. Some of them maybe just kind of mundane, like trying to get lottery tickets and stuff like that. It's stunning how much of this is that. Okay, but anyway, so yeah, you could contact any being, but you want to be intentional. I think Gretchen's point here is, what if it's something other than what you wanted? What if it's not Kali, but it says it's Kali, etc. So these are all very valid concerns, right? From the ānavopaya level. Insofar as we're speaking about things in this way, and we don't have to, we can switch gears and talk about it in a way more refined philosophical way. But speaking about gods and goddesses in this way, then this issue comes up. Like, how do I know it's actually Kali? So therefore, we have puja. We have all these techniques, these modalities that have been developed over time. But the goal, and this is so interesting, the goal is to be possessed by Kali, to become Kali in the sense that this embodied being loses its own individuality and is, in fact, sublated. This individuality is sublated by another individuality, namely Kali. And come on, like we do this all the time with our celebrities and with our media. It's like we adopt the personalities that we inherit from our media. And so we are, in a sense, being possessed by an energy, by a spirit, sublating our own self-expression, maybe. But yeah, so these checks and balances, ideally, they're externally employed. Because we're talking, by the way, now we're talking about external worship, right? We're talking about using tools and implements and offerings, making offerings to things that we consider to be separate and different from us. This is all in the ānavopaya. I would even argue classical or even pre-classical tantric modality. Tantra is a system of ritual, first and foremost. And ritual is some method to contact something, arguably, usually out of a devotional sense. So you want to be loving and devotional. And sometimes it's transactional. I love you in the sense that I'm going to give you stuff because I want you to give me stuff, like knowledge, like power. So it could be transactional. And that is, I think, legitimately decried as being not what we want to do because like that's not love. Love is not shopkeeping. So ideally you have nothing to gain, nothing to lose. You just want to give. You're saying, Kali, I don't care what you do. I just want to give you my mind and body. I want to give you all of me. But here's the thing. Because it's kind of hard actually for Kali to possess the body, even however much we want that, we therefore use a murti. So this is why the murti is important because the body has all of its hangups and samskars. You can do what you can to clear those out. You can wear the outfit to put on the outfit will help that process of possession. But it's hard to happen. Unless you're the right kind of person, it's very hard. And there are all of these risks. So to avoid some of these risks and also to, because it's unlikely to work in this body, we have a murti. The murti is ideally not with any samskars. Isn't that beautiful? The murti is to be made of a substance that is conductive to spiritual vibration. And it is to be spiritualized through a specific process that allows it to be a vessel for Kali. So actually, it's not ideal for her to possess us in the beginning. We're not actually looking for that in the beginning. We're looking for her to be in the image. How beautiful. So ānavopaya is oriented around the image, which we feel to be the living representation of Kali. She actually is in the image. I like to think of my murti as like a house. Sometimes she's there, sometimes she's not. And you might notice, some of you who have come to this house, there are times when the murti is awake. She's there, she's at home. She's in her office, you could say, and ready to take visitors. Other times, she's at other points in the house. People have seen her in other places. Or sometimes she's gone to the smashan. We're quite close to the cremation ground here. Like, if you're going to think from an ānavopaya point of view, you put aside the non-dual philosophical idea that Kali is Shepo, Gyanam, Sankyam, Gatinadaviti, Kramad. You put aside all of those ideas that she's non-dual consciousness, she's the self. Just for a moment, you think in terms of ānavopaya. Here, we think of her as a being. And Swami Vivekananda said, I'm convinced there is a power and that power considers itself feminine and it can be seen and spoken to. So this Kali, who is a woman, who thinks of herself as a woman, and last night I said that word is really loaded, it can mean various things, clearly doesn't refer to gender or genitalia, clearly doesn't refer to cultural or social ideas of what a woman is, but Swamiji did say it. He said that she considers herself a woman, whatever the fuck that means. So it's a feminine spirit, a goddess, and she knows that she's a goddess. She distinctly feels her personhood and she can be seen and contacted the way I can see you and speak to you. And the whole puja operates on that premise. So it's not necessarily that she's always in the murti. And that therefore, every time we do puja, we do a kind of mini prana pratishta again and again to bring her back into the murti. And when you acquire a murti, the first thing you do, arguably, to make it viable to future possessions is prana pratishta. And prana pratishta is clearing the murti of all its samskaras, which it might possess even in a material sense, in order that it becomes a clear vessel. It has a better shot of being possessed than me. Because I have all my baggage, I have all my nonsense. I'm less likely to be able to clear that out. But the rock or the brass, because it's not a person like I am, it's fucked up less in its life, I think. So it has less things to work out. Therefore, it's quicker. I can just quickly clear that rock out or that brass out. And then because it's emptier than I am, it's more likely to take Kali's vibration. So I much rather see Kali in the murti than in this body because I am, as a human being, subject to so much delusion. That's why in the ānavopaya practice, to say that I am Kali is not appropriate. It's not true on this level of practice. To say that I am possessed by Kali is sometimes true, but is also liable to self-deception, to performative pretense, and of course there's a lot of self-delusion. Like you think I feel empowered, therefore it must be Kali or something, but how do I know it's my will and not Ma's will? So somebody asked, I think in the chat earlier, I think Nitya Leela, how do I distinguish the will? I'm speaking from an ānavopaya level. Kali has a will and it's different from yours. Right? Like from the ānavopaya level, we cannot talk about everyone's will as being Kali's will. Kali is the will. I'm not speaking from that point of view. Speaking from the point of view of Kali is a being that can be contacted, a more folk, more magical point of view. He or she wants something. It might be different from what I want, but it's hard to understand that distinction. So sometimes what I want, I deify and say this is what Kali wants. So I say, I'm doing God's will. In the name of God's will, how many people are being raped and murdered and pillaged and killed? Like, if you look at what God's will looks like in the world, it looks horrific. And so that's why the claim that this is God's will doesn't really work, because we can never be sure, although we can be convinced. So there are many people in this world who are convinced that God is telling them to do all sorts of things in the world. And I think that claim is just too dangerous to make. I don't know what God's will is. I don't know if is she speaking to me, or is the devil speaking scripture too? Like, how can I say that my voice is not just my own conditioning? Is it even my intuition? Couldn't it just be my bias, my conditioning, subtly getting me to think this way or that way? So that's dangerous. So the safer thing then would be to see her outside in the image. In the ānavopaya, we're willing to do that. We can say, I'm going to bring Kali, or I'm going to do a ritual in the hopes of inviting Kali. Ultimately, no one brings her anywhere. And then she can come inside, right? So she can come. And again, like, there might be many spirits in this world, and Kali might be one of them. We have a very high and refined theological idea of Kali. We have placed Kali on the position of God. So Kali is the one who creates, maintains, and destroys the world. She is the transcendent reality who is formless and impersonal, but she's also the personal formless reality, and she is also the embodied immanent world and all of its being. So if there is a devil, according to our theology, very refined, non-dual theology, Kali is the devil. Kali is beyond both good and evil. She is the actor in every individual being. Everyone's will is Kali's will. You've heard me speak in this way because I like to speak in this way. I like to speak on the level of refined philosophy, absolute philosophy. But I'm not speaking in that way now. I'm taking a more, let's say, let's put an ānavopaya approach. And from an ānavopaya approach, a folk approach, which is maybe more, you find it more in the hoodoo, kind of voodoo, Santeria, African diaspora context. Kali is a being. And it's not important whether she's God or the devil, because people who live outside of cities don't concern themselves. The lion doesn't concern themselves with the opinion of the sheep. The practitioner of Tantra doesn't concern themselves with urban morality. Morality is something that people in cities do. In the jungle, there is no morality. If you live in nature, you go beyond the idea that there's something called good or moral. It's just the law of the jungle. It's the law of strength. Power is morality. And that's exactly what Socrates argues against in Plato's Republic, that power is morality. We worship power. And that's why it's a very controversial and difficult tradition, because all sorts of immoral things are done in the name of power, like human sacrifice. The Temple of Doom caricatures Kali worship, but it's not that far off, I think, from what does happen, actually, and has happened. I have a relative who was decapitated in a jungle in this context. Like, it's in my family. I have an anecdote of somebody getting decapitated, and I have a grand auntie who watched it. It's like, it happens, and I don't think he consented to it. I think he was dragged to the sacrificial altar and routinely, sacrificed. I think I'm enjoying some good karma of that. Maybe the goddess was pleased. But like, look, a lot of immoral things, even animal sacrifice, like that is also really controversial. So all of that is this world of jungle type, so it's not like there's a sense of God or the devil in the Christian civilized sense. They're just deities, right? And you can think of them even polytheistically. What we're doing is we're pointing to the one in which the many can be reconciled, and we're calling it Kali. But here we're distinguishing Kali from that Kali which we speak about in the Shakta and Shambhava levels, which we'll come to in a bit. But right now we're saying that this Kali might just be a being, and we can't say devil or we can't say God, because like, I don't know, like maybe she's neutral, and maybe she just has her own whims that don't confine themselves to our ideas of what God is or what the devil is, etc. She's inscrutable. Even the gods don't know what she is. But if you take this view, with your exalted Shakta theology aside or included, it won't make a difference in terms of practice. You try to contact her as another being. And so all the rituals are for that. So there's a complex system of rituals that we do, but also there's japa, it's the process of repeating her mantra. It's one of the central practices. But they're not just that, there are dances called karana, ways of putting your body in order to make this energy flow. So any kind of physical postures like hatha yoga, that's kind of karana practice. Any kind of dance that you do, any mudras that you hold in your hands or in your face, that's a mudra. It's called Karankini mudra. And it's not, it's a mudra, but people often think this is mudra, right? Like what you do with your hands. No, this is also a mudra. And look, it's supposed to invite spirit possession because it's supposed to resemble a person's face when they're possessed. So Karankini mudra is a mudra that people do in the possession context. Although Abhinavagupta like redefines it and determines it in another way. Oh, by the way, I'll just give you an example of how the tradition redefines stuff. So this is a kapala. It's traditionally filled with liquor, and it's the kapalika will use the liquor to worship these deities because they're very fond of liquor and other transgressive substances like seminal fluids, blood, meat, etc. So you use this to make offerings, but also you consume the offerings as prasad through the kapala, right? And that's a traditional kapalika thing. Now, Abhinavagupta, he says the kapala, and by the way, of course, this is a metaphor for one's own head. Maybe you can do all that, but Abhinava says any moment of cognition is a skull bowl. He defines the kapala as any object of cognition. So a smell or a sound or a thought, that's a kapala. Kapala is traditionally filled with liquor. So what is the object of your perception filled with, if not the wine, he calls it, the draksha, the rasa of reality? In other words, the object of cognition arises in consciousness itself. And therefore, you can savor of consciousness. You can become drunk with the bliss of recognition by drinking the nectar from the skull bowl of any object of cognition. How beautiful. So now you don't need a skull bowl, you literally just need to have any object and you drink the wine of reality from it. Do you see what's happening here? What Abhinavagupta is doing is he's taking these motifs that are indigenous to the Shaiva world and redefining it along the most refined spiritual and philosophical concepts without negating their role ritually and also culturally and traditionally in the system. So that being said, you can think of Kali in some very abstract terms. But for now, we're just saying there are mudras, and this mudra, Abhinava takes this mudra, Karankini, and redefines it. He redefines aveśa and all of these things. He reinterprets, he rereads some of these folk practices in light of very high metaphysic, very high theology. Okay, so I'm going to close out all of this now with this claim that there are mudras that you might do, like certain things that you do with your face. Oh, by the way, during Kali Puja, there's a moment that I really love. When you're about to bring Ma into the image, you have to do mudra pradakshina. Mudra pradarshana. You're showing her mudras. And so the first mudra you show her is this, Kadga mudra, sword mudra. Then you show her this mudra, which is a skull mudra, nara mudra, shira mudra, head mudra. Then you give her abhaya mudra and you give her vara mudra. So you with your own hands are imitating Kali's hands. It's one of my favorite moments in the puja. And then some people will literally stick their tongue out, and that can be a bit provocative. Sticking your tongue out to Kali can be scary actually. And in that moment, I sometimes don't dare. So this is Lelihana mudra, which is where you put your pinky out like that. So Lelihana is like supposed to represent her tongue. So you show her her own mudras. You do your mudras and you show them to her. And by showing mudras, you're actually presenting yourself as something that can be possessed. Only God can worship God. Only Kali can worship Kali. But I mean this now in a folk kind of possession context. So mudra pradarshana. Sometimes you dress, sometimes, and the worship of a woman, that's very important because you're going to worship Kali. The whole thing is to worship her in a living, breathing person. That's a very high kind of puja. And therefore, the woman, the choice of which woman to be worshipped is important. I think everyone, like every single person, but the tradition does clarify, like that person must be a fit recipient for that yogini or dakini. She must have the qualities of that dakini that you're trying to bring in. So like all these things about possession. And when it comes to the image, there's this beautiful moment of practice that involves mantra, what you say with the speech, visualization, what you think with the mind, action, which you perform on the level of the body, whether it's mudras on the hands or on the face or anywhere else, dance even, songs even, but then of course, above all, there's did I already say mantra? Yeah, mantra. So something you say, something you think, something you do, all of this would be with your body and with your mind. It utilizes the totality of your embodied being in order to interact with Kali, who is seen as another being, maybe disembodied actually, who is trying to be brought into embodiment on this plane. So all of this is called ānavopaya. So most of what we do in Tantra, when you receive a mantra through a guru, through diksha, through initiation, when you chant that mantra in the process called japa, when you perform purashchanas, which is chanting a certain number of that mantra in a system, when you perform homa, fire sacrifice, yaga, offerings, when you do tarpana, which means libations, fireside with oblation. I think in English they call it oblations, and this one is called libations, where you pour wine or something. So you libate, and then you do sprinkling. There are all these different things. You feed brahmanas, you feed people who remind you of that deity or whatever. You do all of these things. They're all called ānavopaya. So most of what we know about Tantra is called ānavopaya. And I'm going to argue that the reason the Malini Vijaya Uttara presents this first, this system called ānavopaya, is one, because it's the precedent, it's traditional. This is maybe how we all started out, but it's also the most universally applicable because we all feel like pashus. We all feel like individuals. We should act like that. Because if I feel like Nishant and I say I am Shiva, that's hypocrisy. And more importantly, I can fool others all I like, but I won't be able to fool myself because the experience of my life won't match up with the high claims that I make about my true spiritual identity. Although I'm right philosophically, it's not helpful actually. So we say if you feel like a bound soul, if you feel like a person, it's better to be a devotee. Not that that takes away from the truth that you are God, but the way that we should act, the way that we should compose ourselves is as such. God is a being who understands herself, who is her personality, and I want to connect to her and talk to her and see her the way I'm seeing you and talking to you. I am God's devotee, distinct from God, working very hard to have an experience of God, at least in the murti, if not in my own body. Right? So that's the whole thing called ānavopaya. And it all comes down to the way we define a pashu. Pashu shouldn't have to be defined. It's such an obvious thing. It's so intuitive. It's just me. It's just a bound, embodied soul. Isn't that nice? So there's Pashu. Now there's Pati. There's Lord. There's Shiva. So contrasted to ānavopaya is something called Shambhavopaya. And this Shambhavopaya does not require anything on the level of the body. You don't have to do any mudras. You don't have to dance. You don't have to do any yoga poses. Nothing. The body is not at all involved in Shambhavopaya, I would argue. Body as we know it, rather. It doesn't involve any mantras. So you don't have to chant any mantra, whether verbally or internally. No mantras. Also, no visualizations whatsoever. There's nothing you have to do with your mind, and no puja. The most important thing about Shambhava Upaya is that there are no external means. There's no individual embodied means. Shambhava Upaya means the way of Shiva, the way of God. So first we have to define God. So maybe next week when we meet, it'll be after Kali Puja actually. It'll be a nice time to talk about Shambhavopaya because it will contrast very nicely to all this stuff that we're talking about now. Because this is all about ritual. It's all about seeing yourself as a discrete individual, separate from others. It's all about seeing God as separate and having devotion and love for God. But in Shambhavopaya, all of that changes. We realize I'm actually not an individual. I'm not an embodied soul. Nasti vishesho nasti kutrachit. There's only one consciousness. Chid dharma sarvadeheshu. Nasti vishesho kutrachit. There's no special embodied individual consciousnesses. There's only one consciousness, and I am that. The Vijnana Bhairava even says, let me just pull up another verse here. I haven't, hold on. It says, Svavat anya sharirepi samvittim anubhavayet. So the Vijnana Bhairava tells us that, my consciousness is not just in me, it's in everyone. I am the consciousness in all people. Imagine that. Think about that. Feel like that. So we're going to learn actually that I'm not a Pashu. I never was, never will be. I felt like one, but that was part of Lord Shiva's play. He pretended to be a Pashu. Shiva eva Pashu bhavaha. Shiva eva grihitva Pashu bhavaha. Lord Shiva alone took on the bhava, the feeling of being a Pashu, which is what I feel now. But I am actually Shiva. I always have been, always will be. I am God. And I, God, for fun, am playing the role of being Nish and feeling myself to be a Pashu and therefore enjoying this language of possession and rituals and all that. But actually, in truth, I've never been a person. In truth, in absolute sense, I am consciousness, as hopefully we'll see next week. And as consciousness, I am in all things as all things. So now when we talk about Shiva, we talk about Kali, we talk about Bhairava, we're moving away from the tradition's understanding of these as deities in a pantheon or energies with a discrete name and form and presence and personality. Now the word Kali just means kshepo, jnanam, sankyam, gatinada, iti kramat, kalanam, Kali, kala, sankarshani, iti abhidhiyate. Kali is that consciousness which projects the world into existence, which cognizes the world, which articulates the world, which moves, which resonates, which is a process and also asequential. That Kali is the one in whom the world is imagined, and she devours it in the end. That's what I am. I, consciousness, am projecting the world, am conceiving of the world, holding the world, delimiting the world. I, consciousness, am imagining the world. And ultimately, when I enter, quote unquote, into samadhi, you could say, or even when I go into deep sleep, where is the world? It's dissolved. I withdraw, I retrieve the world back into its source. That's called Kali, actually. Kali is what I am already. Ritual or no ritual, possession or no possession. And this is what Samavesha means in the Abhinavagupta sense. Here, it's not about spirit possession, but it is. It's about being possessed by spirit, capital S. It's about immersion, absorption, as some scholars recently have retranslated that word. Absorption into the all. And that should bring with it bliss and intoxication and joy. So drink the wine of reality, which is present in the skull bowl of any one of your cognitions, and then be drunk with the self-recognition of your own Shivatva. So when we talk about Shambhavopaya, then we can go into the Vijnana Bhairava, and we'll see there are like sky-gazing practices, Dzogchen, Mahamudra in the Tibetan world, that's very Shambhavopaya oriented. But wait, I want to make a very important point. This Shambhavopaya is being articulated within a highly ritualistic tradition. Look at Tibetan Buddhism. They have some of the most developed Shambhavopaya techniques of all time. Look at Zen Buddhism. They too are a Shambhavopaya oriented practice, which I mean non-conceptual. But don't they have a lot of rituals? The Tibetan world is one of the most ritually rich worlds in all the major world religions. Like there's Catholic Christianity, which is highly ritualized. Eastern Orthodox Christianity, also very rich ritual tradition. And look at Tibetan Buddhism. Oh my God. Right? It's like, to me, Tibetan Buddhism is the last bastion of Hindu Kaula traditions. You know, like they're the ones you go to if you want a kapala, if you want a dagger, if you want all the things that we think about when we think about para, apara, like that. Those things, scorpion, swords with the hilt made of scorpions, all of that is in the Tāntrik literature. It's in Tibet where that's given ritual expression, which has not really been suppressed the way it's been suppressed in India. So it thrives. It is in that highly ritualized context that they articulate this idea that I am that reality. I mean, they won't say it quite like this way, but the practices of sky gazing, of resting, just resting, effortless resting, all of that will be a redefinition of ritual, a redefinition of God. So, for example, the Vijnana Bhairava says, Dhyanam hi nischala buddhim nirakara nirashraya. Meditation is resting in the supportless, spacious, groundless void. Meditation is keeping the mind firm in that void, in that spaceless, groundless reality. Natu dhyanam sharira kalpa hasta mukadi kalpanam. Meditation is not visualizing a form with hands and face and weapons and whatnot, with eyes and whatnot. So what's going on here is we're redefining Kali. Kali is no longer just, again, it's not a negation of that. It's just, she's not just this image. Rather, she is void. She is pure non-dual consciousness. She is spaciousness. She is that which the Vijnana Bhairava calls Bhairava. She is that which the Upanishads call Brahman. She is that absolute which I call God. I mean, that absolute is what I am. And so that is not with hands. It has all hands or it has no hands. What is it? Sasra Shirshaha Purushaha Sasraksha Sahasrapat Sa Bhumim Vishvato Vritvatya Tishta Dashangulam. That reality is without parts, but it's all the parts. It has no hands, but it has 1,000 hands, 1,000 heads. So that Kali is the Shambhavopaya Kali, and they do not contradict. They sound worlds apart. And what we find in the West is people want one without the other. So some people want all the rituals. You want some help? You get the things and come here? Okay, just leave them in the boot, though, then I'll come down and help you with them. Don't bring them up. So if you take the ritual stuff, you might forget about Shambhavopaya, about the non-dual spacious consciousness, etc. And if you take the spacious consciousness Shambhavopaya stuff, you might forget about all the ritual stuff. But practically speaking, the traditions like Tibetan Tantric Buddhism and like this Tantra, these traditions articulate their most refined philosophical ideas about God as pure non-dual consciousness, which is the language you hear me use most often. But they do that within a highly ritualized context in which devotion is developed to the utmost degree. That's why though Shankara talks about Brahman as being beyond God, world, and soul, ultimately Shankara is going to say, Oma Swarupam Tvadiyam Navindanti Deva. Even the gods don't know what you are. Shankara, the great knower, the greatest jnani that India ever produced next to the Buddha, he's praying to Kali. Arguably, he composed Saundara Lahari, he composed all these wonderful Sri Vidya texts. He's a devotee. And arguably, it's only a devotee who could have that level of understanding, because only through love is God grasped. Not through vain intellectual contemplation, but through the ecstasy and affirmation of love will that inscrutable Kali be at any point somewhat understandable to us. And that's the burden of Ram Prasad's poetry and music, to tell us that all we have to do is love Kali as the other. Love her as one's own mother and plunge into her worship and her mantra recitation. As a result of this, we'll come to understand her in a deeper way. And the deeper way is an actual recognition that what she is what I am. What she is what everyone is. She alone is. So now we have this idea of the absolute. We call that the Param. Param means supreme. And the name is actually Para. Para means that which is supreme but personified. So the supreme person, I was arguing that Shiva is that Purna Hamta, that you can call Kali, that you can call Para, you can call Lalita, you can call Shiva, doesn't matter. That person is the absolute. I am the individual, and there is something between us that connects us. And this is called Kundalini or Shakti. So these are the only three things you have to understand in the tradition: me, God, and the world, or this energy, or Kundalini. What is the connection between me and God? And that's dynamic. Either that flows towards God or it flows towards me. When it flows towards my contracted individual embodied sense, that's Kundalini in the Muladhara chakra, to use yogic language now. But if I want to realize God, the Kundalini will rise, and then I stop identifying with Nish and I start identifying with Kali. And then through identifying with Kali as the other, then Kundalini goes into the Sahasrara, and there Kali is recognized as me. So I dissolve, Kali dissolves, what remains is also Kali. And that Kali is Kali in her formless aspect, in her non-dual aspect. But all three are equally real. So the Malini Vijaya Uttara will present ānavopaya, then it will present Shaktaupaya, then it will present Shambhavaupaya, a dualistic, a qualified non-dualistic, and a non-dualistic way of approaching things. And all three are equally valid and are to be used all together. I think that's the secret of our tradition, is that it doesn't exclude any practice or any part of our being. It tries to integrate everything. So as an ānavopaya practitioner, you can think in dualistic terms, no problem. As a Shambhavaupaya practitioner, you can give up all rituals. You can even give up the body and mind and just rest spontaneously in the sweet and intimate sense of being the one reality in all things as all things. Rest in the spaciousness between thoughts, between breaths. That is Shambhavopaya, sudden, spontaneous immersion into your true identity as consciousness beyond body and mind, and yet present in all cognitions. That's fine, but so too is ritual. And both together, that's what the Kaula world looks like. Rituals to access that state of spontaneous immersion into consciousness, and rituals from that place of immersion, from Khechari, Bhairavi, Mudras, you act in a ritualized way. So all of this is, I think, what it means to practice the Kaula Marga. And you see, ānavopaya comes down to the definition of anu, which hopefully we've done today. So this whole lecture has been, what is an anu? What is a paśu? What is a jīva? What is it to be me? Not in a philosophical sense, just in a naive, like, intuitive felt sense. And if I feel different, if I feel separate from others, then necessarily I should look upon God as separate too. That's only right and only reasonable, given that's how I feel. So then if God is the other, the proper approach is puja, worship, is love, is devotion, is communion, is relation. So you can just think of this as the rest of your life in this sadhana is, for in one sense, just cultivating your relationship to Kali. That's it. I'll close with Sri Ramakrishna's metaphor. He says, like an ocean looks black from the distance, when you go near and you take the water in your hand, you find that it's colorless. Similarly, from a distance, Kali looks like she has arms. And indeed she does, because she looks like that. And that's what makes her beautiful, actually. She has arms and face and all that. But the closer and closer you go, the less and less of you will feel. The more and more of her you will see, until you enter into her, and then you find that she has no form. She's just formless, clear light of consciousness. She is empty luminosity. That's Kali. The true ground of Kali is one that includes all of these. It includes me as a separate self, it includes her as God, and it includes that in which both God and the self ultimately dissolve. She is empty luminosity. She is the clear light of the void, to use that language. She is Brahman, she is Shiva, Bhairava, whatever. But that Kali is realized through sadhana, grasped through ecstatic love. And having grasped that, you know what Sri Ramakrishna did? He continued to worship Kali in the image. That's Tantra. The ability to continue relating to that which I've realized now is my very own essence nature. So although the sky is colorless, thank God for sunsets. Thank God for blue and for orange, and thank God for clouds. Because if the sky was not seen from a distance, would it have its beauty? Thank God for the distance between me and reality, because that allows me to talk to her as mother. May it always be so. Om. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanam Astu. Jai Shri Ramakrishna. Jai Ma Kali.